She saved his life twice. The first time, with trembling hands in the middle of a storm, stitching shut a wound that should have killed him. The second time, with a breaking heart, pulling poison from his blood after he had already destroyed hers. But the third time, when his enemies took their newborn son and pressed a gun to that tiny chest, nobody could save Kang Min-jae from himself. The most feared mafia boss in all of Asia was about to kneel in the dirt and beg, and the woman he had humiliated, imprisoned, and abandoned was the only reason he still had something worth kneeling for. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me until the very end. This one will cost you something. The rain came in sideways off the Korea Strait, the kind that didn't fall so much as attack. Sheets of water driven horizontal by 50-kilometer winds that turned Busan's narrow clinic alley into a black river running ankle-deep with storm runoff and cigarette wrappers and whatever else the city couldn't hold on to. The wooden sign above the door of the free clinic on Choryangdong's back street swung on one rusted chain, the other having snapped sometime in the previous hour. Nobody had fixed it. Nobody who worked there had time to fix anything that wasn't bleeding. Zuri Bennett had been on her feet for 11 hours. She knew this not because she had checked a clock. The power had flickered out twice already, and the backup generator was running the sterilization unit and the IV drip for the elderly woman in Bay 2 and exactly nothing else. But because her lower back had moved past aching into something that felt structural, like the vertebrae themselves were filing a formal complaint. She was 31 years old, and her body had been logging grievances since she was 23, since the forward operating base in Kandahar, where she'd learned that the human back was not designed for 14-hour shifts, crouching over field cots in temperatures that swung 40 degrees between noon and midnight. She rolled her neck, heard it crack in 3 places, and kept moving. The clinic served the people Busan's formal medical system had decided weren't worth serving. Undocumented migrant workers, elderly residents who couldn't navigate the insurance bureaucracy, the young women from the entertainment districts who came in quietly after closing time and asked for things they couldn't ask for anywhere else. Dr. Hyon, who ran the place, was 62 and moved like a man fighting gravity on principle. He'd gone home at 8 when his wife called about the flooding in their building's basement. He'd trusted Zuri with the overnight. He trusted her with most things. She had that quality. People handed her their worst moments, and she didn't flinch. It was the storm that brought the man in. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice. He didn't say anything when he came through the door, didn't call out or ask for help, which told her something immediately, told her this was a man who had trained himself not to ask for help under any circumstances, including, apparently, this one. What she heard was the quality of his breathing. She was behind the curtain in Bay 1, checking gauze inventory by flashlight. And she heard the door open, and she heard the breathing, and she knew before she pulled the curtain back that whoever had just walked in was working hard to stay conscious. He was standing just inside the doorway, one hand braced against the wall, water streaming off him in rivers. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual use rather than a gym. His jacket, expensive, she registered that absently, the kind of dark wool that cost more than her monthly rent, was soaked black and pressed flat against his torso. And even in the dim emergency lighting, she could see the darker stain spreading from his left side. Too dark for water, too thick. "Sit down," she said. Not a question. He looked at her. His eyes were... She would think about this later, in the weeks after, when she was trying to make sense of everything. His eyes were the most controlled thing about him. Everything else was failing. His skin had gone the wrong color, gray-tinged beneath its natural warmth, and his jaw was set in the particular rigid way she recognized as a man refusing to let his body do what it was trying to do. But his eyes were steady, measuring her. "I don't need..." "You're bleeding through your jacket," she said. "Sit down." Something moved in his expression. Not compliance. She didn't think this man had ever experienced compliance as a concept that applied to himself, but a kind of recalibration. He assessed her the way she'd seen officers assess terrain. Then he moved to the examination table and sat, and even the way he sat was controlled, weight transferred deliberately. No sudden movements, as though he was managing himself the way you'd manage a vehicle with a failing engine. Zuri pulled on gloves and crossed to him and reached for his jacket, and he caught her wrist. Not hard, but certain. My people are outside, he said. His English was precise, faintly accented, each word placed with care. They'll come in if I don't, then send them a text, she said. Or don't. I don't care who's outside. I care about the 6 inches of you that's currently trying to empty itself. She held his gaze. Let go of my wrist. He did. She peeled the jacket back. The shirt beneath was a dark charcoal. Smart choice, she thought. The dark color bought you time before people noticed. But it was soaked completely on the left side, the fabric clinging to a wound that had been roughly compressed at some point, a folded cloth wedged against it that had long since saturated. She pulled the cloth away and looked at the wound without expression, the way she'd been taught to look at wounds. The way she'd practiced until the sight of opened flesh produced in her not horror, but simply information. Knife. Single entry point, approximately 4 centimeters, low on the left lateral torso. The depth she couldn't assess yet, but the bleeding pattern suggested it had caught the muscle wall without penetrating the cavity. If he'd taken it in the cavity, he'd be unconscious already, probably dead. Lucky. Conditionally lucky. When did this happen? An hour? Perhaps more. You've been walking around with this for an hour. I was occupied. She got a pressure dressing on it and looked up at his face. He was watching her with that same measuring quality, and up close she could see things she hadn't from across the room. The fine scar along his jawline, old and well-healed. The way his hands rested on his thighs with his fingers very slightly spread. The posture of a man who kept his hands visible by habit. The absence of any identification, any wallet, any phone visible on his person. What's your name? She asked, because she asked everyone. A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Jin, he said. She didn't believe him. She filed it. Okay, Jin, I'm going to numb the area and close this. You've lost blood, but not critically. You're going to need to hold still. I'm aware of how sutures work. Great, then we'll get along fine. She worked. The generator hummed. Rain hammered the corrugated roof in waves, each gust building to a peak and releasing, rhythmic and savage. The elderly woman in Bay 2 murmured something in her sleep. The man called Jin sat absolutely still while Zuri cleaned the wound, administered the local anesthetic with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions, worse light, worse tools, with actual gunfire providing counterpoint, and began to close. She was 4 sutures in when he spoke again. You're not Korean. No. American. Yes. But you speak... He had caught something, a word she'd used earlier with the woman in Bay 2, a phrase of comfort she'd delivered without thinking. Your Korean is good. It gets the job done. A silence. She placed another suture. Why are you here? He asked. In Busan, at a clinic like this. She didn't look up from her work. Same reason anyone does anything. It seemed like the right place to be. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. She was aware of him studying her profile while she worked, not in the way men sometimes studied her, the assessment that moved from clinical to something else, but in the way he'd studied the room when he came in, cataloging, trying to understand the terrain. She found it less offensive than she might have expected. She was used to being looked at. She was a tall black woman in a Korean port city working a night shift in a blackout. She had long since stopped expecting to move through the world without drawing attention. You were military, he said. Her hands didn't stop. What makes you say that? The way you move under pressure. Most people, even medical people, their hands shake when it's serious. Yours don't. Lots of people have steady hands. Not like that. That's trained. She tied off the 7th suture and clipped the thread and sat back on the stool and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd started working. He held the look without discomfort. Combat medic, she said. 3 tours. You're right. I was military. You're also right that I'm not going to ask you how you got that wound because I genuinely don't want to know, and I'm going to guess you weren't going to tell me anyway. She stripped her gloves. I'm going to guess a lot of things about you and keep them to myself. Because you came here instead of a hospital, which means either you can't go to a hospital or you won't. And either way, it means there are things about you that would complicate my night if I knew them. Something happened in his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. the look of a man who was accustomed to being read inaccurately and was encountering rarely someone who read him straight. "You're very direct," he said. "I find it saves time." The generator stuttered. The single functioning light above them dimmed and surged. In the half-second of near darkness, Zuri became acutely aware of the weight of the storm outside. The particular quality of isolation that came from being in a small lit room with a stranger while the world outside was unraveling. Then the light steadied, and they were just two people in a clinic again. "I'll need to see those in 5 days," she said. "The sutures. If you develop fever, increased redness, swelling beyond what's there now, you go to a hospital regardless of whatever the complications are. A wound infection will kill you more certainly and more slowly than whatever put the knife in you." "I understand." "Do you have someone who can monitor "I have people." Of course he did. She dressed the wound and gave him a paper bag with supplies. Antibiotic ointment, sterile gauze, printed aftercare instructions she'd translated into Korean herself in the clinic's first month. And he took it from her without comment. He stood, and she watched him absorb the pain of standing with the same controlled methodology he'd applied to everything else. And she thought, whoever this man is, he has been hurting for a very long time and has simply decided that pain is not a relevant variable. She found that she recognized that. She didn't know what to do with the recognition. "There's no charge here," she said. "This clinic is free." He looked at the paper bag in his hand. Then he looked at her. "I know," he said. "I know about this clinic." Before she could process what that meant, he reached into an interior pocket, and she was aware of herself not flinching, a thing she was somewhat proud of, and withdrew not a weapon, but a card, plain white. A single phone number, no name. He set it on the examination table between them. "If you need anything," he said, "while you're in Busan. I don't take money from patients." I didn't offer money. Then he walked to the door, and she was struck by how differently he moved now. Still controlled, still deliberate, but she could see him managing the wound, the infinitesimal adjustment in his gait, and she thought about how much discipline it took to walk like that when your side was on fire, and she thought about her own years of walking through things that were on fire, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, something she didn't immediately have a name for. He paused at the door with his hand on the frame. "Jin," she said. He turned. "Whatever it is you're in the middle of," she said, "be careful with that wound. The stitches will hold if you don't do anything stupid, but they're not designed for—" She gestured vaguely at him, at the whole of him, at whatever category of violent activity had produced the knife wound in the first place. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. "I'll try," he said. Then he was gone, and through the clinic's single small window, Zuri watched the black vehicles. 3 of them, she counted, large and expensive, idling in the flooded alley, pull away into the storm, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the card he'd left, and the sound of rain on the roof and the sleeping woman in Bay 2, and she felt the particular specific ache of having briefly touched something real in the middle of a world that was mostly noise. She put the card in her pocket. She went back to work. She did not think it would matter. She was wrong. The weeks after the storm were ordinary, the way weeks are ordinary when nothing has yet broken open, full of small tasks and minor urgencies, and the slow accumulation of days that don't announce their significance. The clinic filled and emptied and filled again. Dr. Hyun came back and noticed the fresh suture supplies she'd used, and she told him a patient had come in during the storm, and he nodded and didn't ask more because he had learned that Zuri handled things. She worked her shifts and walked home along the waterfront in the early morning light and watched the container ships move yet in and out of the harbor and tried not to think about a pair of steady eyes or the particular sound of controlled breathing in a dark room. She was 13 days past the night of the storm when she sat in the small apartment above a noodle shop that she was renting by the month and watched the evening news on her laptop while eating rice from a bowl, and the news showed a photograph, and the rice bowl stopped halfway to her mouth. The photograph was of a man in a dark suit at some kind of formal event, caught by a long lens camera outside what the caption described as a Gangnam private club. He was looking sideways at something off-frame, his face in three-quarter profile, and even at that angle and at that distance there was no ambiguity. None. The jaw, the quality of stillness in the posture, the particular way his hands hung at his sides. The chyron beneath the photograph read, Kang Min-jae. suspected head of Kang Syndicate, largest organized crime network in southern Korea, linked to extortion, weapons trafficking, and 3 unsolved murders in Busan Port District. Zuri set the bowl down very carefully. She watched the segment. She watched the reporter describe the Kang organization in the practiced voice of someone conveying danger at a safe remove. 17 years of operation, suspected ties to Chinese and Japanese criminal networks. A man who had never once been successfully prosecuted despite 3 separate investigations. A man who moved through Busan's criminal landscape like weather, unavoidable and invisible. They showed a second photograph, older, taken from a security camera somewhere, grainier. The same man, younger, harder, a cut above his eye that hadn't yet become the scar she'd traced the path of with her eyes in the clinic light. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet apartment and listened to the rain, because it was raining again. Busan in the fall rained constantly, as though the city was trying to rinse itself clean of something. And she thought about the card in the pocket of her jacket on the hook by the door. And she thought about the way he'd said, "I know about this clinic." And she thought about all the ways that sentence could be parsed, and how many of those ways were frightening. And she thought, okay. That happened, and now it's over, and now you know what it was, and now you don't think about it anymore. She was a practical woman. She had survived things that required practicality as a baseline condition. She made a decision, and she meant to keep it. Then 3 weeks later, she bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy 2 neighborhoods over from where she lived, paid cash, and sat on the floor of the clinic bathroom before her morning shift and watched 2 lines appear, and the decision she'd made became suddenly irreversibly complicated. She did not cry. She was not, in that moment, built for crying. She sat on the cold tile floor and breathed and did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. One night, stormlit, a man who'd been bleeding and careful and briefly, unexpectedly real. And she thought about her options with the same methodical clarity she applied to everything. And at the end of the thinking, she arrived at the same place she always arrived, the truth. Whatever else she was uncertain about, she was not uncertain about the truth. The child had a father. The father had a right to know. That it was the most feared criminal in southern Korea was a complication. But Zuri Bennett had operated in conditions where every available option was a complication, and she had learned that complications were just problems that hadn't been solved yet. She told herself this. She almost believed it. Finding him was not simple. She didn't use the number on the card. She wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready to be the kind of woman who called a Mafia boss with this particular kind of news while standing in an alley. So she asked questions carefully, quietly, in the way she'd learned to gather information in environments where information was a controlled substance. She knew a journalist who covered organized crime for a Busan weekly, a sharp-faced woman named Park Soo-yeon who drank too much and was more afraid of being boring than of being in danger. Park knew the geography. She knew which buildings and which districts carried the invisible weight of the Kang organization's presence, knew which restaurants didn't ask questions, and which hotels kept rooms permanently reserved for people who didn't use their names. She didn't tell Park why she was asking. Park didn't ask. She just drew a map with a pen on a napkin and said, "Be careful with that family. They're not the kind of people who owe you anything for surviving them." Zuri folded the napkin and put it in her pocket next to the card she'd been carrying for weeks. She found the building, a commercial tower in Haeundae-gu, glass and steel, and the particular blankness of a structure that doesn't want you to think about what happens inside it. And she stood on the opposite sidewalk for a long moment and thought about what she was walking into and whether she was ready, and concluded that readiness was a concept that didn't apply to this situation. She crossed the street. She never made it through the lobby. The sound reached her first. Not gunfire. Not yet. But the sound that preceded gunfire, the sudden absence of ambient noise, the way a street went silent before something catastrophic, a held breath in the city's chest. She was 30 meters from the building entrance when the black vehicles appeared at the far end of the block, moving fast, and behind them, not black vehicles, something rougher, older, moving wrong. And then she heard it, the sound that her body recognized before her mind caught up. A sound she'd first heard at 23 in a country on the other side of the world, and every trained response she had came online at once. She moved, not away, toward. Because that was apparently what she had always done, would probably always do. The ambush hit the convoy at the building's side entrance. She counted the seconds in the chaos the way she'd been trained to count them, establishing a timeline in real time. 4 vehicles involved, sustained small arms fire, professional formation suggesting this wasn't opportunistic, wasn't random, wasn't any of the things that violence got called when people wanted to pretend it didn't have architecture. She was behind a parked delivery truck when she saw him. He'd come out the side entrance running, or what passed for running when you were already hit. She could see it in his movement, the same compensating hit she'd cataloged in the clinic, except worse now, much worse, blood on his left side again, and this time she thought it wasn't just the old wound. He was directing his men with one hand while the other pressed against his torso, and he was very pale, and she thought, he is going to be dead in less than 10 minutes if the next 10 minutes go the way they're currently going. She thought this with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything. Then she stopped hiding behind the delivery truck, and she walked out into the middle of the firefight. Later, people who'd been present would not be able to adequately explain what they'd seen. A woman, they would say, just walked out, didn't run, just walked, fast and direct, toward the man in the middle of everything, ignoring the firing that was, they would agree on this, comparing stories, somehow missing her, or perhaps redirected by his men who'd seen her coming and didn't know what to do with someone who didn't behave like a target was supposed to behave. He saw her at the same moment she reached him. His face did something complicated. You, he said. Me, she agreed. We need to move right now, and you need to stop trying to be vertical and let me take some of your weight. And I need you to tell your people that I'm not a threat, because I'm going to need both hands for the next several minutes, and I'd prefer they not point guns at them. A long beat in which the firing continued around them, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, and then he said something in rapid Korean, and the men nearest to them shifted. My vehicle. Too exposed. The building. We need to get you inside the building. She got under his left arm, taking his weight across her shoulders, and felt how much he was actually leaning, even as he tried not to. Felt the dampness of the blood through his jacket. Felt him breathe in a way that told her this was serious. More serious than the clinic. More complicated. Tell me how bad. I've been worse. That's not what I asked. Tell me how bad. 2 rounds. Left side. They didn't... He exhaled, controlled. They didn't go deep. She thought, he could be right about that. She thought, he could also be wrong in ways that will kill him in the next hour. She thought, move first, assess after, same as always. Same as it was at 23 in the dirt with someone else's blood on her hands, and a radio that wasn't getting signal, and the simple, unbearable requirement of continuing to function. Move, she said. They moved. The building's side entrance opened to a stairwell, and his men cleared a path, and she got him up 2 flights through noise and chaos, and the smell of cordite drifting in from the street, and then through a door that required a biometric scan that one of his men handled, and then they were in a corridor that was silent, carpeted, the temperature-controlled quiet of money and insulation. The contrast was so violent it made her ears ring. He was heavier on her by the time they reached the room, a large private office. She registered it peripherally, the kind of space that contained power in its dimensions. And she got him to the couch, and he sat, and then she was working, her hands finding the rhythm they always found, the rhythm that didn't require thought, only sequence. Only the next step and the next, cutting away clothing, assessing, applying pressure. Speaking in the flat directive tone she'd used 100 times in conditions worse than this, to men in worse shape than this. Stay with me, she said. Eyes open, talk to me. About what? Anything, doesn't matter. You walked into a firefight, he said. Yes. Why? She pressed gauze against the first wound site, and he didn't make a sound, but she felt his whole body tighten. Because you were going to die. You don't know me. I stitched you up 5 weeks ago. I know your wound architecture better than your own doctors do. She assessed the second entry point, lower, at an angle that was more concerning. Lie back. I need to see the exit wounds. There aren't. Then we have a problem, but let me see. She worked. He lay back against the arm of the couch, and she thought he'd go quiet the way people often went quiet under her hands. The particular submission of a body that had run out of options, but he didn't. He kept watching her. That same quality. Measuring, cataloging, trying to understand the terrain. "You're pregnant," he said. Her hands stopped for exactly 1 second, then they continued. "That's—" "Yes," she said. She hadn't told him that. She hadn't told anyone that. She was 11 weeks, not showing. There was no visible reason he should— "How do you—" "I know things," he said, and his voice had gone quieter, which might have been blood loss or might have been something else. "About the clinic, about the people there. When I found out you worked there, I found out—" He exhaled again, that careful management of breath over pain. "I found out things about the staff. It's what I do. I don't know whose it is." "Mine," she said, with a sharpness that surprised her. "Of course, I meant—" "I know what you meant." A silence filled only by the sound of her working. "It's yours," she said, because the truth was the truth, and she'd come to tell him, and she was going to tell him. "That's why I was coming to find you today, to tell you." She felt him go very still, more still than the pain required. "That's not possible." "I'm a medical professional," she said. "I have a fairly solid understanding of what's possible. We only—" He stopped. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel him processing something. Not the information itself, she thought. He'd processed the information in a fraction of a second. He was processing what the information meant, what it required, what world it was asking him to inhabit. "I don't—" He started again, and for the first time his voice contained something that wasn't control. "I'm not able to— I'm not asking you for anything," she said, still working, still focused on his wounds, grateful for the work because the work kept her voice steady. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know. What you do with it is your business." She found the second round still lodged in muscle, high enough that it hadn't done what she'd feared, and she exhaled something she'd been holding and began the work of stabilizing what she could stabilize with what she had. "I need to get you to a hospital," she said, "or your people need to bring a surgical team here. I can do a lot, but I can't do this without proper equipment." "My physician will come," he said. "I'll have them called." "Fine, I'll stay until they arrive and give them the handoff." "You don't have to—" "Yes," she said, "I do. Because I'm the one who knows your current status, and because until your physician gets here you need monitoring, and because—" She stopped, because the truth of it was simpler and more complicated than clinical rationale. "Because I'm the one who came back." Something moved across his face that she wasn't prepared for. Something that looked like it hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the rounds in his torso. He looked at her the way the drowning look at shore, not with gratitude exactly, but with the particular bewilderment of a person who hasn't expected to survive. "Why?" he said. "Knowing who I am, why would you come back?" She pressed another layer of gauze and met his eyes. "I told you," she said. "I came to tell you the truth. I don't make exceptions for inconvenience." He held her gaze for a long moment in the carpeted silence of the room, while his blood came away on her hands, and somewhere in Busan the storm that never really ended was building again offshore. "Kang Min-jae," he said. "That's my name, the real one." "I know," she said. "I looked you up. And you still came." "I still came." Outside, the sounds of the street were slowly normalizing, the firefight having ended or relocated, the city resuming its noise with the indifference of cities to whatever happens in their arteries. Inside the room, the two of them existed in a suspension that Zuri recognized as significant and was not ready to name, a moment where one version of something ended and another, undefined and probably dangerous, was deciding whether to begin. His physician arrived 40 minutes later. Zuri gave the handoff with professional precision, wound locations, her field interventions, timeline, current vitals she'd been tracking by hand, and the physician, a woman in her 50s who showed no surprise at any of it, listened carefully and nodded and thanked her. Zuri gathered the remains of the supplies she'd used and moved toward the door. "Zuri," she stopped, turned. He was looking at her from the couch, pale and managed and still. "I'll have someone take you home," he said. "I can take myself home." "I know you can." A pause. "Let me do this." She thought about it. She thought about the card in her pocket and the napkin map and the 2 lines on the test and the thing she'd felt that night in the storm when he'd paused in the doorway and looked back at her, and the way his eyes had done something almost human. "Okay," she said. She didn't think that was the end of it either. She was right. The escort home was a single vehicle, a dark sedan, a driver who didn't speak. She sat in the back and watched Busan go past the window, the port lights, and the neon and the black water of the harbor. And she pressed her hand against her still flat stomach and thought, "I've made decisions in worse situations than this." And she thought, that is not exactly reassuring, and she thought, I know. She went to sleep that night and dreamed of nothing important, and woke in the morning to a Busan that looked the same as it always looked, rain-bright and indifferent, and full of people who didn't know what was happening inside the buildings they walked past. She didn't hear from him. A week passed. 2. She went to work. She told Dr. Hyun about the pregnancy, and he was warm and fussy and immediately began rearranging her schedule with the earnestness of a man who had daughters and knew how little that helped. She accepted the rearrangement because she needed the energy she'd been spending on her feet. She thought about the man in the office and the way he'd said my name, the real one, like it was a concession, like it cost him something. And she thought about the child growing in her with its father's stillness and its father's unknown capacity for either cruelty or something else. And she waited. 3 weeks after the day at the building, she arrived at the clinic on a Tuesday morning and unlocked the door and found, taped to the inside of the clinic's supply cabinet, an envelope. Inside the envelope was a document. The document was, in plain and careful language, a statement of financial provision, an account established, a sum that made her breath catch, available to her and to the child, no conditions, no strings, no requirement of anything. And beneath the document, written in a hand that was precise and somewhat formal, a single line, "I am not able to be what this requires, but this I can do." She read it 3 times. She sat down in Dr. Hyun's chair. She thought, he has decided. He has made his calculation, and this is his answer, and she should respect it, should take the money and the freedom and the clean exit he was offering and not look back, should build the life she was going to build anyway, with slightly more financial security and slightly more information about the kind of man her child's father was. She thought this, and she believed it, and she made the decision in the clear light of a Tuesday morning in a Busan clinic. What she did not account for was the organization Kang Min-jae ran, and the enemies it had accumulated, and the particular way that violence does not ask permission before it arrives on your doorstep. She did not account for what happened next. None of them did. The envelope stayed on Dr. Hyun's desk for 4 days. Zuri didn't touch it after that first morning. She worked around it the way you work around something you haven't decided about yet, aware of it in her peripheral vision, aware of the weight it carried, aware that the moment she picked it up again, she would have to make a choice that couldn't be unmade. So she left it. She told herself she was thinking. What she was actually doing was waiting for something she couldn't name, some internal signal that would tell her which version of her next life she was willing to accept. The signal didn't come. What came instead was Seo Yeren. She walked into the clinic on a Thursday afternoon, when Dr. Hyun was out, and the waiting room held 3 patients, and the autumn light came through the windows at a low flat angle that made everything look slightly wrong. Zuri was at the desk doing paperwork, and she looked up, and her first thought, purely visual, was, this woman is expensive. Not in the way that meant she'd spent money on herself, though she clearly had, but in the way that meant money had always been present, had shaped the bones and the posture and the particular way this woman moved through a room, as though the room had been arranged in advance for her arrival. She was perhaps 35, Korean, dark-haired, wearing a coat that was the color of old cream and fit her like it had been built around her specifically. Her face was beautiful in the architectural way that suggested both genetics and maintenance, high cheekbones, a mouth set in a line that communicated something between boredom and precision. Her eyes went to Zuri and stayed there, which was interesting. Most people's eyes moved around the clinic first, taking inventory, and only then settled on the person they'd come to see. This woman had come knowing exactly what she was looking for. "You're the American nurse," she said. In English, precise, almost accent-free. "I'm one of them," Zuri said. "The one who treated Min-jae, twice." Zuri set down her pen. "I don't discuss patients." "He's not your patient." The woman moved to the desk with the same deliberate ease she'd carried through the door. "He's your, what would we call it? A complication." Her eyes moved briefly to Zuri's midsection and then back up. The message was clear, and it was meant to be clear. My name is Seo Yerin. I was engaged to Kyung Min-jae for 2 years. Congratulations. Past tense. He ended it 6 months ago. She said it without apparent emotion, the way you report weather. Or he believed he ended it. We have different perspectives on that. I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because you're sitting in the middle of something you don't understand, Yerin said. And I'm the only person who might be willing to explain it to you. Out of, let's call it professional courtesy. Woman to woman. Professional courtesy, Zuri repeated. You're a nurse. You assess situations. You make decisions based on available information. Yerin placed one hand on the desk, a single ring on her index finger, jade set in pale gold. I'm offering information. What you do with it is your concern. Zuri leaned back in her chair. She had sat across from officers in the field who used this exact register. The offering of information as a form of control, the performance of helpfulness as a delivery mechanism for threat. And she had learned that the correct response was to be very still and very quiet and to listen for what wasn't being said. Talk, she said. Yerin talked. She talked for 12 minutes, which Zuri tracked without obviously checking the time, and what she said was this. Min-jae was not a man who changed, not fundamentally. He was a man who had built an empire on the premise that every person in his world was either an asset or a liability, and that the correct treatment of each category was total utilization or total elimination. He had ended their engagement not because of feeling, but because she had become a liability. She knew too much. She had opinions. She had begun to cost more in management than she returned in value. That was Min-jae's arithmetic. It was the only arithmetic he knew. The child he's carrying, Yerin said, and something moved in her voice at this word that she controlled quickly, efficiently, will be assessed the same way. Assets are protected. Liabilities are removed. And me? Yerin looked at her. You're already a liability. You're a foreign national with no ties to his world, no leverage, no understanding of how it functions. You came to him twice and gave him something, your skill, your honesty, something he doesn't encounter, and he will spend the next several months deciding what category that puts you in. She paused. I've seen him make this decision before. It doesn't end well for the person he's assessing. Zuri held the woman's gaze and thought, some of this is true. Some portion of what she's saying is accurate because it has to be, because the most effective manipulation always is, and the question is which part. What do you want? Zuri asked. I want you to take the money in that envelope, Yerin said, and Zuri went very still, because she had not told anyone about the envelope, had not spoken of it, had left it on the desk under a patient intake form where it was not visible. And I want you to leave South Korea. And if I don't? Then you stay, Yerin said simply, and you find out for yourself. And the child finds out with you. She left with the same ease she'd arrived with, and the waiting room was quiet, and the 3 patients had the particular trained in curiosity of people who had learned that some conversations were not meant to be heard. Zuri sat at the desk and looked at the space where Yerin had been standing, and felt something cold move through her that wasn't fear exactly, but was in the neighborhood of fear, was what fear became when you trained yourself out of the paralysis it caused, and were left with only the adrenaline and the clarity. She picked up the envelope. She put it in her bag. She finished her shift. That night she sat in her apartment above the noodle shop and looked at the white card on her kitchen table, still there, still carrying the single phone number. And she made the call she'd been not making for 6 weeks. It rang twice. I know who this is, he said. Someone came to see me today, she said. Seo Yerin. A silence that had texture. Where are you? My apartment. I'm fine. It wasn't that kind of visit. What kind was it? The kind where someone tells you things they want you to believe while also demonstrating that they know things they shouldn't. Zuri pressed the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the harbor lights. She knew about the envelope. She knew about the pregnancy. She knew where I work and apparently where I live, which I'm inferring from the fact that she found my clinic without asking me for directions. Another silence. Longer. Are you asking me to explain her? He said. I'm telling you she exists and she's moving around in spaces that are apparently connected to you, and I'm telling you that she wants me out of the country, and I'm asking you to tell me what I'm actually dealing with. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was deciding something. She was right. I'll send someone to you tonight, he said. Someone I trust. You'll be moved to. I'm not going anywhere with someone I don't know. Zuri, come yourself or don't send anyone. She heard the flatness in her own voice and didn't soften it. I'm not a package to be handled. If you want to talk, come talk. If you don't, I'll handle this the same way I handle everything. It's not safe for me to. I didn't say it was safe. I said, come yourself or don't send anyone. Another silence. She listened to it. 2 hours, he said. He came in 3, which she suspected was the closest to 2 he could manage, and he came without the convoy. A single car, a single driver, himself in the back, and she watched from the window as he got out and looked up at the building with an expression she couldn't read from 4 floors above. He moved carefully. The wounds were recent enough that she could track his recovery in the way he distributed weight, and she thought, he's not fully healed, he came anyway. File that. She let him in. The apartment was small, a kitchen, a main room, a bedroom behind a sliding door, the particular economy of a space rented by someone who traveled light and hadn't committed to staying. She'd made tea because her hands needed something to do and because the ritual of it was grounding, and she poured him a cup he didn't ask for and sat across from him at the small table and looked at him in real light for the first time. He looked like a man who was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't touch. There were shadows under his eyes that weren't from the wounds and a tightness around his jaw that she recognized as chronic rather than situational. The mark of someone who had held a particular tension for so long, it had become their resting state. He was wearing dark clothes, no suit, something closer to casual, and it made him look, not younger exactly, but less constructed, less like the photograph on the news. He looked at the tea and then at her. Urine is not a threat you can manage the way you manage other things, he said, because apparently they were starting there, no preamble, which she respected. Tell me what she is. She's someone who understands the organization better than most people who work within it. I made the mistake of letting her learn it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. When I ended our engagement, I believed she would settle, accept the terms I offered, and move into a different position. I was wrong. She told me she has a different perspective on whether it ended. His jaw tightened. She has a different perspective on everything. That's not the same as being correct. Min Jae? She used his name deliberately, watched the small response it produced. She knew about the envelope. That document was in my locked clinic, in a drawer I didn't tell anyone about. How does she know? He was quiet. You have someone in your organization feeding her information, Zuri said. It wasn't a question. Possibly. Not possibly. Certainly. She knew things she couldn't know otherwise, which means someone who knows your movements told her. Zuri set down her cup, which means the thing she's running, whatever she's actually doing, has infrastructure. She's not acting alone and she's not acting impulsively. He looked at her with that expression she'd first seen in the clinic, the one that registered something unexpected and filed it. You think like an intelligence officer. I was trained by them. For 3 years I sat in briefings where people tried to understand what the enemy knew by mapping what the enemy was willing to tell us. She leaned forward slightly. She came to me to do 2 things. She came to frighten me into leaving, yes, but she also came to show me that she could reach me. That was the more important message. She wanted you to know she can reach me. The silence that followed had a different quality than the others. She could see him processing this, not the logic of it. She thought he'd arrived at the same logic already, but what the logic required of him, what it cost. I need to move you, he said finally. I heard you the first time. Not to one of my properties, somewhere off the grid of what she knows. He was thinking out loud, she realized, which was probably unusual for him, which meant something. I have a house it's outside the city. Secured perimeter, minimal staff. I'm not going to a house with a secured perimeter, Zuri said. Zuri, I have a job. I have a clinic that needs me. I have a doctor who is counting on me and patients who have nowhere else to go. She held his gaze. I'm not going to disappear into one of your protected spaces because a woman in a very expensive coat frightened me. She should frighten you. She did. It didn't help her. Zuri looked at him steadily. What I need from you is information. I need to know what she's capable of. I need to know what she wants, the real thing she wants, under the things she told me. And I need to know whether the people around you that she's turned are dangerous to you. Because if she's building something inside your organization, you're the primary target, not me. I'm just the leverage." He stared at her. Something in the architecture of his face shifted. One of those movements she'd begun to map, the micro changes that meant something was getting through the control. "You came to Busan to volunteer at a free clinic," he said. "Yes." "You were a combat medic." "Yes." "Why does someone with your training end up in a free clinic in a foreign country instead of somewhere with resources, with a salary, with—" "Because I needed somewhere that needed me more than I needed it," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her slightly, the way truths sometimes surprised you by how simple they were when you finally said them. "I've been somewhere that needed me completely before. It almost destroyed me. I needed somewhere that needed me in a smaller, manageable way while I figured out who I was going to be next." She paused. "Then you walked through my door bleeding, and apparently I am still incapable of leaving well enough alone." He looked at her for a long time. "I can't protect you if you won't let me control the parameters," he said. "I know." "Then what are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to treat me like someone with agency. I'm asking you to give me information and let me make decisions with it." She put her hand flat on the table between them, not toward him, just flat, a gesture of plainness. "I'm carrying your child. I'm not doing that from inside a cage, no matter how nice the cage is. If you can't work with that, tell me now." The quiet stretched. Outside, a vessel in the harbor sounded its horn, a long, low note that came through the walls of the apartment and faded. "Yiren has been meeting with representatives of the Cho family," he said. "The Cho syndicate has been trying to move into Busan's port district for 18 months. We've blocked them at every point." He said it flatly, like reading from a document he'd memorized. "If she's feeding them information about me, about my movements, my assets, my—" He stopped. His eyes went to her midsection for just a moment. "About anyone connected to me. That changes the security calculation significantly." "How significantly?" "The Cho family doesn't negotiate. Their expansion model is elimination." He met her eyes. "Not acquisition. Elimination." Zuri absorbed this. "And Yiren is helping them build a case against you." "Against the organization, yes. And against anyone I might—" He stopped again. The word he wasn't saying hung in the air between them. "Anyone I might protect. Anyone who might make me protective. Anyone who has gotten close enough to matter." "She's going to use me," Zuri said, "and the baby, as a way to expose your weakness." "Yes." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Then you need to find whoever she's turned inside your organization, and you need to do it before she moves. Because once she moves, the leverage is gone, and she shifts to the next phase." She looked at him. "Do you know who it is?" "I have suspicions." "Then act on them." "It's more complicated than—" "It's always more complicated. Act on them anyway." She stood and picked up the teacups and took them to the sink and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the dark window and her own reflection in it, her own face, tired and certain, and something else she couldn't name. "I'm not leaving Busan, but I'll let you put someone on the building, discreet, someone she won't see." She heard him stand. She heard him cross the small room. She didn't turn around. "Why are you being reasonable about this?" he said. He was close enough that she could feel the shift in the air. "You have every reason to take the money and leave and never see me again." "I have the baby's reason to stay," she said. "That's not what I mean." She turned then, because not turning would have been its own kind of statement, and he was closer than she'd tracked, close enough that she could see the things she'd cataloged that first night. The scar along the jaw, the controlled posture, the eyes that were the most awake part of him. And underneath the control, underneath the precision, something she'd glimpsed in the clinic when the generator stuttered and the light went wrong. Something that looked like a man who had been alone for a very long time and was standing, confused, at the edge of something that had no precedent in his experience. She took a step back, gave them both room. "I'll let you know if anything changes," she said to him. "The clinic number, or the card." He held her gaze for one more moment, then he nodded. He moved to the door with the same careful management of his wounds that she'd tracked all evening. "The person on the building," he said, hand on the door. "His name is Day. He won't approach you. You won't know he's there unless you need him." I hope I don't need him. So do I. He left. The room felt different after, the way rooms did. Slightly rearranged, the air redistributed by someone else's presence and then left to resettle. She stood in the middle of it and pressed her hand flat against her abdomen and thought about all the ways the next several months could go, mapped them the way she'd been trained to map terrain, looking for the exits and the choke points and the places where everything could go wrong at once. She thought she had a reasonable picture. She did not have a reasonable picture. She was missing the most important piece, the piece that would change everything, and she wouldn't know she was missing it until it was too late. The next 2 weeks were almost ordinary. Day was good. She never saw him, which meant he was exactly what Min-jae had said, professional and invisible. The clinic ran. Dr. Hyeon fussed about her prenatal vitamins with the dedication of a man who had decided this was his project now. The Busan autumn sharpened into something colder, the harbor wind acquiring an edge that made her wrap her coat tighter on the morning walks. And she let herself exist inside the ordinary for 14 days without looking at the edges. Then Min-jae stopped answering his phone. Not immediately. She didn't call constantly, didn't expect constant contact. That wasn't what they were to each other. But on the 4th day of silence, she called the number and it rang out. And on the 5th day, she called again, and it went to nothing. Not voicemail, just dead air. And on the 6th day, she went to the clinic and found Dr. Hyun already there, earlier than his usual hours. And his face, when he looked up, told her something was wrong. There was a news report this morning, he said carefully, about the Kang organization. She felt the cold thing move through her again. What kind of report? Internal conflict. They're saying, he paused, chose words. They're saying the leadership is compromised, unspecified. But there was an incident at the Haeundae property last night. Police were called. There are rumors. I need to make a call, she said. She went to the supply room and stood between the shelves and called the number and got the dead air and stood very still and thought, okay. What do you know? What do you actually know versus what you're afraid of? Separate those things. What she knew, 6 days of silence. News report of internal conflict. An incident at a property she'd been inside. What she was afraid of? Everything. What she could do? She could call Park Soo-yeon, who covered organized crime and had more current information than the regular news cycle. She did this. Park answered on the second ring, and Zuri could hear the particular alert quality in her voice that meant Park was already in the middle of something. I was going to call you, Park said. What's happening? Min-jae was poisoned 3 days ago. Someone got into the food supply at the Haeundae compound. Still unclear whether it was staff or something introduced externally. He's alive, but it was... She paused. It was close. And it was designed to look like it wasn't poison. Designed to look like a relapse of a pre-existing condition. Zuri's mind was moving fast and clean the way it moved in emergencies, the emotional response shunted aside, processing only. What kind of poison? That's the thing. The family physician caught it early, but only because it presented unusually. Whatever it wasn't standard. It was targeted. Someone understood his specific biology. A pause. Which means someone with access to his medical history. Seo Yerin, the woman who had been engaged to him for 2 years, the woman who had access to everything. He's conscious? Zuri asked. As of this morning, yes. But his inner circle is... There's a crisis of confidence. Half his lieutenants are questioning whether the organization can function with leadership this compromised. Some of them are starting to look at other arrangements. Cho family arrangements? Silence on the line. Park, Zuri said. I don't know, Park said. But the timing isn't coincidental. The Cho family made 3 aggressive moves on Port District operations in the last 72 hours, things they wouldn't do if they expected meaningful resistance. A beat. Whatever Yerin told them, they believe it. They think he's finished. Zuri stood in the supply room and thought about a man lying in a compound with poison in his blood and half his organization deciding he wasn't worth staying for. And she thought about what she'd said to him in her apartment. She's going to use me as a way to expose your weakness. She'd been right about the method. She'd been wrong about the order. Yerin hadn't used Zuri as the lever. She'd used Zuri to distract, to pull Min-jae's attention toward the external threat, while the internal one was being built inside the walls. And while Min-jae was calculating how to protect Zuri, Yaren had walked into the compound carrying whatever she was carrying and done what she'd come to do. And now he was in a bed somewhere being kept alive by his physician, and his organization was fracturing, and Zuri was standing in a supply closet in a free clinic in Busan holding a phone and carrying his child, and she felt the particular weight of a situation that had just become irreversible. She called Dae's number, the contact she'd been given for emergencies, a number she'd memorized and hoped not to use. He answered immediately. "I need to get to him," she said. A pause. "Miss Bennett, I know what he has. I know more about his medical history than his physician does, because I've treated him twice, and I took notes both times, and I know what's in his file from the clinic intake." She stopped, breathed, refocused. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you I can help him. Get me in." Another pause. Longer. "There are people inside the compound who are— The situation is not stable," Dae said. "There are people asking questions about how the poison was introduced. Some of them—" He stopped. "Some of them are blaming me," Zuri said flatly. The pause was its own answer. "Someone's been telling them," Dae said quietly. "Telling them you had access, that you were inside the building during the firefight, that you administered treatment without witnesses." Zuri closed her eyes. Opened them. "Yaren, we don't know. We know." She felt something settle in her. Not calm exactly, but the opposite of panic, the cold, certain settling that happened when a situation became clear, even if what it was clear about was bad. "She poisoned him, and now she's blaming me for the poison. She's turning his own people against the one person who might be able to actually help him." She pressed the phone harder against her ear. "Dae, get me in. Whatever it costs, whatever you have to tell them, get me in. Because if you don't, and if he doesn't get the right treatment in the next—" She thought about the poison, about what Park had said, targeted, designed for his specific biology. "I don't know how long we have before this becomes a conversation about something other than treatment." The silence on the line was the longest yet. Then Dae said, "I'll send a car." The car came in 40 minutes. She gathered what she needed from the clinic supplies, not everything, but what the situation required, what her training told her the situation required. And she told Dr. Hyun she had a patient emergency, and she watched his face do the thing where he understood more than she was saying and decided not to say what he understood, and she walked out into the Busan afternoon. The drive to the Haeundae compound took 20 minutes. For those 20 minutes, she sat in the back of the vehicle and felt the city move past her and thought about the compound she was driving into. The people in it who'd been told she was responsible for what had happened to their boss. The woman who had set this up with surgical precision. The man who was in a bed somewhere inside those walls who might or might not be conscious. Who might or might not be able to confirm who she was and what she'd come to do. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She thought, "I've been here before. Not this room, not this situation, but this exact position. Driving towards something that might go badly. Knowing that not going was the only alternative and that the alternative was worse." The compound gates came into view. She sat up straighter. Whatever was waiting on the other side of those gates, she was going to walk through them the same way she'd walked into the firefight at the Haeundae building. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had never once been a good enough reason to stop. The gates opened, the car moved through, and the first thing she saw on the other side was Seo Yaren, standing in the courtyard with her hands folded in front of her and an expression of composed concern that was one of the most precisely constructed things Zuri had ever seen. And Zuri understood in that moment that she had walked directly into the second half of the trap. Yaren spoke first, in Korean, to the three men flanking her, and whatever she said produced an immediate response. The men moved, not toward Yaren, toward Zuri and Dae, who had been 2 steps ahead of Zuri through the gate, turned, and his face said everything his voice didn't have time to say, before one of the men caught his arm, and the other 2 reached Zuri, and she felt hands on her shoulders, and she did not fight it, which cost her something, the trained refusal to submit to being handled. But she looked past the men at Yaren, and she said, in Korean, "That was good enough for this, clear and flat. Whatever you told them, they're going to know it's wrong. When he wakes up, they're going to know." Yaren looked at her with the particular composed patience of someone who has thought further ahead than the current moment. "If he wakes up," Yaren said in English, a courtesy Zuri did not find comforting, That will be a conversation I look forward to having. Then she turned and walked back toward the compound's main entrance, and the men holding Zuri's shoulders steered her in a different direction. And the last thing Zuri saw before they moved her inside was the courtyard security camera mounted above the gate, its red light blinking steady and indifferent, recording everything and helping no one. Inside the compound, in a room that had no windows and a lock she could hear engage from outside, Zuri sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her hands around her knees, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The medic's rhythm, the rhythm she'd used in the field when the situation had outrun the plan, and what remained was only the body and the breath and the next decision. She was 4 months pregnant and locked in a room inside the compound of a man who might be dying, and she had been framed for the thing that was killing him. And the woman who had done this was currently standing somewhere in this building, constructing whatever the next phase of this looked like. She breathed. She thought, what do you have? Inventory. What do you actually have? She had the medical bag they hadn't taken from her, which meant either they hadn't thought to take it, or Yaren had decided leaving it was part of the calculation. She had her phone, which had no signal in this room, which was itself information. The room was either shielded or below ground, and based on the temperature, she thought below ground, a basement room, which meant the window she'd half registered in the door frame was at ground level or close to it. She had her training, and she had her notes on Minjae's medical history, and she had the specific knowledge of what Yaren's poison would be doing to his system right now, if she was right about the compound. She thought she was right. She had been right about most things in this situation and wrong about one. The one that mattered. She had underestimated how completely Yaren had already won the internal argument. Zuri had assumed she was walking into a situation where suspicion existed. She had walked into a situation where the verdict had already been delivered. She sat on the floor for 11 minutes. She counted, and then she heard the lock disengage. The man who came through the door was not someone she recognized. Late 40s, heavy set, a face that had the particular blunt quality of someone who had delivered and received violence for long enough that it had become neutral to him. He looked at her sitting on the floor, and something moved in his expression. Not sympathy, but something like recalibration, the same kind she'd seen in Minjae that first night. "You're the nurse," he said. In English, accented, effortful. "Yes. They say you poisoned him." "They're wrong. Seo Yaren poisoned him. I came here to help treat him." She kept her voice level, her eyes on his. "What's his current status?" The man was quiet, deciding something. "Worse than this morning," he said. "Then you need to make a decision fast," Zuri said, "because whatever's in his system is going to move into the second phase in the next few hours, and after that the treatment options narrow significantly." She held his gaze. "I know what it is. I know because I know his medical history, and I know Yaren, and I know what she would use on someone with his specific profile. Let me see him. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing. If I'm right and you don't let me see him..." She stopped. "You lose him." The man's jaw worked. "You have something to treat it?" he said. "I have a start. I need your physician to confirm and assist. We do this together, with witnesses, so there's no question about what I'm administering or why." She met his eyes. "I don't need trust. I need access. There's a difference." Another silence. Then the man stepped back from the doorway. "5 minutes," he said. "If the physician says no, you come back here." Understood. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked through the door without looking back and followed the man through a corridor that was underground. She'd been right, and up a staircase and through 2 more doors, and then into a room that was the opposite of the windowless cell. Large, bright with the particular intensity of medical lighting, equipment she recognized and some she didn't. The physician she'd handed off to after the firefight standing at a monitor with an expression of controlled alarm that told Zuri everything she needed to know about how the numbers were looking. The physician looked up when Zuri came in. Recognition moved across her face, followed by something more complicated. "They told me you were responsible," she said. "I know what they told you. I know what's in him, and I know why, and I need you to listen to me for 3 minutes." Zuri crossed to the monitor without waiting for permission and looked at the readouts and felt the cold settling deep in, because she'd been right. She'd been exactly right, and the numbers confirmed it. Aconitine derivative. Modified, probably synthesized specifically, which is why it presented atypically, because whoever made it knew his cardiovascular baseline and adjusted the compound to work within a normal variation range until the accumulation hit critical. She looked at the physician. You've been treating the symptoms. Yes. You need to treat the mechanism. The cardiovascular presentation is secondary. The primary action is neurotoxic, and it's still accumulating because you've been managing the heart rate without addressing the source. She opened her bag. I have activated charcoal and atropine sulfate as a starting point. It's not complete. You'll need additional agents I don't carry, but it slows the accumulation and buys us time to get what we need. She looked at the physician steadily. You tell me I'm wrong and I'll go back to the room. You tell me I'm right and we start now. The physician looked at the monitor, looked at Zuri, looked at the man in the bed. Zuri let herself look at him then, for the first time since she'd entered the room. The word that came to her was diminished, which frightened her more than she'd expected it to, more than was strictly clinical. He was pale in a way that wasn't like the firefight pallor, wasn't the managed gray of a man holding himself together. This was something underneath the skin, something systemic. His breathing was shallow and slightly irregular, and his hands lay at his sides with the loose quality of hands that were not currently under anyone's direction. She looked at him and felt something move through her that she categorized and set aside and did not examine. I think you're right, the physician said quietly. Then let's work. They worked for 2 hours. The heavyset man stayed in the room, watching, which Zuri registered as both a threat and a form of protection. His presence meant she was witnessed, every action documented in at least one person's memory, which was exactly what she'd asked for. The physician was good, adapted quickly, asked the right questions, and didn't ask the wrong ones. They moved through the treatment in stages, Zuri narrating each step with the flat precision of someone building a record, and the monitoring equipment began to show the shift she'd predicted, gradual and then measurable, the numbers moving in the directions numbers needed to move. At the 90-minute mark, Min-jae's breathing changed, still shallow but regular. The irregularity, the arrhythmic pattern that had told Zuri how close the timing had been, smoothed out into something a body could sustain. She stood at the bedside and watched his chest rise and fall and felt the exhaustion hit her in a wave, the physical weight of the last several hours landing all at once, and she pressed her free hand against her abdomen and breathed in thought, okay, this part is done. Then Min-jae's eyes opened. He was disoriented. She could see that, the particular unfocused quality of someone coming back from a place the body had been trying very hard to go to permanently. His eyes moved across the ceiling and then to the physician, and then, with the slow deliberateness of a man operating at reduced capacity, to Zuri. He looked at her for a long moment. You're here, he said. His voice was rough, almost inaudible. Yes. They said... He stopped, swallowed. They told me you... I know what they told you. She kept her voice level, clinical, held the tone of a nurse at a bedside and not whatever else was present in the room. Don't talk yet. Your system needs another 30 minutes before we can assess cognitive function accurately. I know my cognitive function. You've been poisoned. Humor me. Something moved in his face. A ghost of the expression she'd first seen in the clinic, the one that went in the direction of but didn't quite reach a smile. Yeren, he said. Yes. The evidence There are files. They showed me files before I... He stopped again, breathed carefully. Before I lost consciousness. Files showing you had met with Cho Hyun-seok. Photographs. Communications. Zuri went very still. I haven't met with anyone named Cho Hyun-seok, she said. I don't know anyone by that name. I know. He held her gaze. I know that now. But 2 days ago, when they showed me, his jaw tightened. I was already compromised. The poison was already affecting my judgment, and I didn't know it was poison yet, and I made a decision. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. I told them to find you. You told them to find me, she said slowly. I thought... He stopped. She could see it cost him something to say this. Cost him in the way that admissions cost people who had built entire architectures around never needing to admit anything. I thought the files were real. I thought you had... I thought you were... You thought I was a spy, she said, working for your enemy. He didn't look away. Yes. The room was very quiet. The equipment hummed. The heavy-set man by the door was very still. The order I gave, Minjay said, before I lost consciousness. I don't know if my men acted on it. I don't know what... He stopped, and this was the first time she'd heard something in his voice that was not control, not management, not the careful architecture of a man who never let the structure show its load-bearing points. This was something else. I need to know what they did. Zuri stood at the bedside of the man she had now saved 3 times, if you counted tonight, the man who had believed for 2 days that she was his enemy, the man who had given an order she did not yet know the content of. And she thought about the room they'd put her in, and the lock she'd heard engage and the phone with no signal, and Yaren standing in the courtyard with her hands folded and her composed expression. "What was the order?" she said. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not the measurement, not the cataloging, not the controlled intelligence she'd mapped over weeks of fractured contact. What she saw was something that looked like the precise moment a man realizes that the worst thing he has done cannot be undone by the fact that he has now realized it. "Zuri," he said, "what was the order, Minjai?" And the monitor beside the bed, which had been steadying, produced a single sharp alarm tone as his blood pressure spiked, and the physician moved, and in the controlled medical chaos of the next 30 seconds, with the heavy-set man finally stepping away from the door and toward the bed, Zuri stood perfectly still and understood that she was about to find out something that was going to require her to make a decision that nothing in her training, nothing in her years of managed crisis and forward operating bases and storm night clinics had actually prepared her for. Because whatever the order was, it involved her, and she was still inside the compound, and the gate was a long way behind her. The monitor alarm stopped. The physician silenced it with a practiced hand, adjusted the drip, spoke in low, urgent Korean to the heavy-set man who had moved to the other side of the bed, and for 30 seconds the room operated on pure medical logic, the clean, impersonal choreography of people managing a body in crisis. And Zuri stood inside it and felt the question she'd asked hanging in the air unanswered, and understood that she was going to have to wait for the answer, and that waiting was going to cost her something. Minjay's blood pressure came down. Slowly, in increments, the numbers retreating from the spike towards something sustainable. He lay against the pillow with his eyes closed, and Zuri watched the rise and fall of his chest, and told herself that the clinical picture was improving, and that the clinical picture was the thing she needed to focus on, and that the question she'd asked could wait another 5 minutes without the waiting changing its answer. She almost believed that. His eyes opened again after 4 minutes. He found her immediately, which meant he'd known where she was standing even with his eyes closed, which told her something about the quality of his awareness even compromised. "The order," she said. She wasn't going to perform patience she didn't have. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man assembling the words for something that doesn't have good words. "I told them to contain you," he said. "Hold you at the secondary facility until I could..." He stopped. "Until I could determine the truth." "The secondary facility," she said. "A property in Gijang outside the city." "How long?" "Zuri, how long was the hold order, Minjai?" The physician had stepped back from the bed, giving them space with the professional discretion of someone who understood that what was happening here was not medical. The heavy-set man had not stepped back. He was watching this exchange with the flat attention of someone recording it for later use. "Indefinite," Minjay said, "until the investigation into the Cho connection was complete." She heard it, let it sit in the room. Indefinite, 8 months pregnant and indefinite. "There's something else," he said, and his voice had gone quieter in the way that things got quiet when they were about to be worse. "The order included, Day reported to me that you had accessed my medical records from the clinic, the intake file, without authorization. I accessed my own treatment notes to help save your life. I know that now. 2 days ago, with Yaren's files in front of me and the poison already working on my judgment, it looked like," he exhaled, "it looked like intelligence gathering, like you had been building a profile." "So you believed her," Zuri said. "You believed the files. I believed the evidence I was shown. You believed the woman who had spent 6 months telling your own lieutenants that she was still your fiancée. You believed fabricated photographs over 8 weeks of..." She stopped. "Over 8 weeks of what? Of walking into firefights for him. Of treating his wounds in a storm. of sitting in her apartment telling him the truth when every practical instinct she had told her to take the money and leave. She stopped because naming those things out loud felt like handing them to something that would use them badly. Yes, he said. Simple, no architecture around it, just yes. She turned away from the bed. She stood facing the wall with its medical equipment and its monitors, and she breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth, and she thought about the room with no windows and the lock engaging and the phone with no signal, and she thought about the 4 months of pregnancy inside her body that she'd been navigating alone while Busan did what Busan did around her, and she thought about a handwritten line on a document left in a clinic. I am not able to be what this requires. She had thought that was the worst thing he would say to her. She had been wrong. The order, she said, still facing the wall, her voice flat and clinical as a report. Was it carried out? Day was in the process of... Min-jae stopped. She heard him, the hesitation, the calculation. When you called Day and told him to bring you here, he diverted from the original instruction. So Day chose me over your order. Yes. Then Day has better judgment than you do. She turned back around. She held his gaze across the room and felt the full weight of what she was saying and said it anyway. I'm going to finish the secondary treatment protocol with your physician. I'm going to write detailed notes on everything I've administered and everything that needs to happen in the next 72 hours. And then I am going to leave this compound and I am going to continue my life. And if anyone in this building attempts to stop me, I want you to understand clearly that I will not go quietly and I will not go without leaving a record of exactly what happened here with exactly the right people. The room was very still. I'm not going to stop you, Min-jae said. I didn't ask. She went back to work. The next hour was the most professionally demanding performance of Zuri's life. The requirement of functioning at full clinical capacity inside a body that was exhausted and shaking with something she wasn't calling what it was. In a room with a man who had issued a detention order for an 8 months pregnant woman because a poisoner had shown him the right photographs at the right moment. She did it because the work required it, and because the alternative was the baby's father dying from neurotoxic accumulation, and she was not going to let that happen regardless of what he had done, because the child deserved better than a dead father, even if the father had not yet demonstrated he deserved anything at all. The physician assisted without comment. The numbers continued improving. When the protocol was complete, Zuri wrote 3 pages of handwritten notes in precise clinical English and handed them to the physician and picked up her bag. Min-jae was watching her. There's something you need to know, he said. There are several things I need, she said. Your information is not currently at the top of the list. Yeren is still in the building. Zuri stopped. My men haven't moved her, he said, because half of them still believe what she told them, and the other half don't know what to believe, and I've been in this bed. He said it with a flatness that was its own form of shame. She has been in this building for 2 days, moving freely. Zuri turned to face him fully. She's been in this building. Yes. For 2 days. Yes. She did the arithmetic. 2 days of Yeren moving through the compound with full access and a story already established, and Min-jae unconscious and his lieutenants divided. 2 days was enough to consolidate something. 2 days was enough to build the next phase, if the next phase had been prepared in advance, which it clearly had been, which was the only explanation for how thoroughly everything had been staged. What has she done with those 2 days? Zuri asked. Min-jae's expression did something that she recognized, that she'd seen on the faces of officers who'd received reports they hadn't wanted to receive. The expression of a man confronting the scope of what he'd failed to prevent. She's been meeting with 3 of my senior lieutenants, he said. Separately, I had audio. Day was running audio from the compound security, and the recordings show her presenting a plan for organizational restructuring. He paused on the word like it tasted wrong. In the event that my condition deteriorated. Organizational restructuring, Zuri said. She is proposing herself as an interim operational head, in alliance with the Cho family. His voice had gone to something very quiet. A merger. My organization absorbed into Cho Hyun-seok's network with Yeren as the transition administrator. The room was so quiet that Zuri could hear the harbor wind somewhere above them, through the building's walls. 3 of your senior lieutenants, she said. Yes. Are they going to take it? The pause was its own answer. Two of them, he said. Possibly. Zuri stood in the middle of the room and thought about what a woman like Yeren was. Not what she'd told herself about Yeren, the elegant threat, the composed woman in the cream coat, the external reed, but what she actually was, structurally. A woman who had spent 2 years learning the interior of this organization from a position of intimacy, who had left that position, or been removed from it, without losing any of the knowledge, who had spent the subsequent 6 months building a parallel structure inside the existing one, quietly, patiently, using resources and relationships that Minjae hadn't known to watch because he'd been watching the outside. She thought about all of this and she thought, she's not finished. Where is she now? Zuri asked. Her room's in the East Wing. You have rooms assigned to her. A beat. She occupied them when I was unconscious. I'm told she moved her things from her apartment 2 days ago. She moved into your house while you were dying in a bed she put you in. The heavy-set man by the door made a sound that was not quite a word. Yes, Minjae said. Zuri picked up her bag and moved toward the door, and the heavy-set man stepped aside without being asked, and she went through it and into the corridor, and she had made it 4 steps when she heard Minjae's voice behind her, rough and low, and stripped of everything except the thing underneath. I'm sorry. She stopped walking. It doesn't fix what I did, he said. She hadn't heard him get out of the bed. She heard it now, the physician's sharp protest, his overriding it. And when she turned, he was upright, one hand on the door frame, the IV still in his arm, wearing the expression of a man who has never once in his life said those words and is discovering that they are insufficient for what he's trying to carry and is going to say them anyway. I know it doesn't fix it. I'm saying it because... He stopped. Because I need you to know that I know what I did. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. I'll call to check on your numbers tomorrow, she said. The physician has everything she needs. She walked down the corridor and up the stairs and through the compound, and she did not look for Yeren, and she did not look for Dai, and she kept her eyes on the door at the end of each passage, and she kept breathing, in and out, the medic's rhythm, the rhythm that kept everything moving when everything wanted to stop. She walked out into the compound courtyard. The autumn air hit her, cold, salt-edged, real, and she stood in it for one moment with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, and she pressed both hands against her abdomen, and she thought, we're okay. We're out. We're okay. Then a car pulled up, not Dai's car, different vehicle, longer, darker, and the back door opened, and Seo Yeren stepped out onto the courtyard stone in front of her. Zuri hadn't heard her come. The East Wing was on the other side of the compound. Yeren had either been watching from somewhere or had been told by someone, one of the men inside, one of the 2 lieutenants who'd been listening to her restructuring proposal, that Zuri was leaving. She had come to see it. To see Zuri leave, Zuri thought, to confirm. They stood 10 meters apart in the compound courtyard in the cold afternoon and looked at each other. He's recovering, Yeren said. Not a question. Yes. Because of you. Yes. Yeren absorbed this. Her face showed nothing, which was itself a form of showing something. The control required to show nothing in this moment indicated the significance of what was being controlled. You should leave Korea, Yeren said, while it's still your choice. You've said that before. I'm saying it again. With more information available to both of us. Yeren took 2 steps forward, slow, deliberate. You understand what you've done by saving him. You've disrupted a process that was close to complete. Months of work. Another step. People who were ready to move will now hesitate. The Cho family will reassess their timeline. Everything that was in motion. She paused. You've pushed it back. Perhaps significantly. Good, Zuri said. Yeren looked at her with something that was almost respect and almost contempt, and landed in the space between them. He put you in a room, Yeren said. He issued a detention order for you, a pregnant woman, because I showed him 3 photographs and a document I had fabricated in 4 hours. She said this without apparent satisfaction, simply reporting, that is who he is. That is what he does with people who get close to him. He uses the tool until the tool becomes complicated, and then he removes the complication. Her eyes moved briefly to Zuri's midsection. Your child will be a complication eventually. You know that. Zuri held the woman's gaze and said nothing. I'm not your enemy, Yeren said. You poisoned him. I removed an obstacle. The first crack in the composed surface, not emotion exactly, but force, the pressure that had been behind the composure showing at its edge. He ended a 2-year engagement by having one of his men deliver a document to my apartment. No conversation, no explanation. A document, and a week later my access to every account he had given me was terminated. She stopped, breathed, rebuilt the surface. I spent 2 years building something with that man. I learned everything about that organization because he needed someone who could understand it and help him run it, because the men around him are muscle and loyalty but not intelligence, and he needed intelligence. The word came out with a precision that felt personal. And when he decided I had become inconvenient, he processed me out like a terminated employee. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere inside the compound, a door opened and closed. That's a real thing that happened to you, Zuri said. And it was a real wrong, and none of it is a reason to poison someone. Isn't it? No. Zuri felt something firm up in her voice. The thing that firmed up when she'd been through enough in the last several hours that she had run out of patience for performance. You could have left. You could have taken whatever you had and built something else and let what happened between you two be what it was. A thing that hurt you and made you angry and that you survived. Instead, you spent months building a mechanism to destroy him, using me and my child as components. Her voice stayed flat, but something burned behind it. You told me you came to warn me. Woman to woman, professional courtesy. That was a lie. You came to activate me. You came to see if I could be used, and when you decided I couldn't be used, you decided I could be framed instead. Yeren was silent. The photographs, Zuri said, the files you showed him, the communication records linking me to Cho Hyun Seok. How long did those take to make? A week, Yeren said. Simple. Like it was nothing. A week, Zuri repeated. So from the moment you came to my clinic, you were already building the frame. The warning was the setup. You came to establish contact so the fabricated records would have a plausible foundation. Yeren looked at her with the expression of someone who has been accurately described. You're more capable than I expected, Yeren said. Most people are, Zuri said, when you underestimate them. For the first time, something moved in Yeren's face that was not constructed. Something quick and genuine and then gone. Leave Korea, she said. Last time. I'll leave when I decide to leave. Yeren looked at her for one more moment, then she turned and got back into the car, and the car moved toward the east wing, and Zuri watched it go and felt the shake hit her. Finally, the full-body response that she'd been holding off through sheer operational necessity. The tremor that moved through her hands and her knees and her chest. The body's invoice for everything the last several hours had cost it. She stood in the middle of the courtyard and shook and breathed and waited for it to pass. It passed. Day appeared from somewhere. He was good at appearing from somewhere. She had to give him that. And he looked at her face and didn't ask questions, which was the right call. Take me home, she said. He took her home. In the car, she sat with her hands in her lap and watched Busan pass the windows. And she thought about everything she'd said to Yeren and everything Yeren had said to her, and she sat with the things she hadn't said, the things she'd felt move through her when Yeren said it. He processed me out like a terminated employee. She sat with what it meant that she'd understood that she'd recognized it not as Yeren's story, but as a pattern, a documented behavioral pattern in a man she was carrying a child for, a man who had just, as Yeren had noted without embellishment, issued an indefinite detention order for an 8 months pregnant woman because someone had put 3 photographs in front of him. She sat with it the way you sit with something you can't unfeel. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. She stood inside it and looked at the ordinary objects, the kettle, the coat on the hook, the window with its harbor view. And she felt the gap between this room and what the last several hours had contained. And she sat down on the bed and thought for the first time about leaving. Not because Yeren had told her to. Yeren's instructions had the opposite of their intended effect. But because she sat in her apartment at 4 months pregnant and she ran the calculation again, the one she'd been running since the storm, and this time when she ran it, the variables had changed. Minjae had believed the photographs. He had believed them because of the poison, yes. She knew that. She held that as a clinical fact. But the poison had worked with something that was already there. Some foundation of mistrust so deep and so habitual that when the right pressure was applied in the right way, it collapsed into exactly the shape Yaren had predicted it would collapse into. He had said, "I'm sorry." She believed that he was. She also believed that sorry was the beginning of something, not the end of it. That the man who had been shaped by 17 years of operating on the premise that everyone was either an asset or a liability did not become a different man because he felt bad about one decision. That the architecture was still there, the same architecture that had produced the detention order and the fabricated evidence, and 2 days of an unconscious man's compound being reorganized under him. She sat on the bed and put her hand on her abdomen, and she thought about Elijah. She had been calling him that in her mind for 3 weeks. The name she'd settled on in the way you settled on names, quietly and without announcement. And she thought about what kind of father a man like Min Jae would be when he was the version of himself that was sorry, and what kind of father he would be when he wasn't. She thought about all of this for a long time. Then her phone rang. "Park Soo-yeon." She answered. "Tell me you're not in that compound anymore," Park said. "I'm home." "Good. Zuri—" Park stopped, and the quality of the stop was wrong, the hesitation of someone who has information they don't want to deliver. "I need to tell you something. I've been sitting on it for an hour because I was trying to verify it." "Tell me." The Cho family moved up their timeline. Tonight. Something changed in the last few hours. I don't know if it's because Min Jae survived or because someone inside the compound told them he survived, but Cho Hyun-suk has put his people in motion. A breath. They're not going after the organization's operations this time. They're going after him, directly. When? Tonight. I have 2 sources. Both say tonight. Zuri looked at the window. The harbor lights were coming on in the early dark, scattered across the water like things that had been dropped and hadn't finished falling. "Does he know?" she asked. "I don't know what he knows. His compound communication has been, the internal conflict means nobody's sure who's reporting to who right now." "Park." Zuri stood up. "Does he know?" "I don't think so," Park said quietly. "I think whatever Yaren's people are still inside the compound are managing his information flow. I think he's lying in a hospital bed believing the immediate crisis has passed." A pause. "I think he's been set up to be caught completely unprepared." Zuri was already moving. Bag, coat, keys. "Zuri," Park said. "You just got out of there. You're pregnant. Whatever you're thinking—" "I'm thinking that someone needs to tell him," she said. "Send Day." Day reports to him. If Yaren's people are managing his information flow, they'll intercept anything from inside the organization. She pulled on her coat one-handed. It has to be someone from outside. It has to be someone they won't see coming because they've already decided she's been neutralized. The silence on the line had the particular quality of someone trying to think of an argument that would work. "You don't owe him this," Park said. "I know," Zuri said. "After what he did today—" "I know, Park." "Then why—" "Because the baby deserves a father who is alive," she said. "Even a flawed one. Even one I'm furious with. Even one who has a very long way to go." She was at the door. "That's the only reason. That's enough." She went out into the Busan night. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was walking back into the most dangerous compound in the city, and the woman who had engineered everything that had gone wrong in the last 72 hours was somewhere inside it, and Cho Hyun-suk's people were somewhere in the city moving toward it. And Zuri had a medical bag and her training and a name she'd been quietly calling her son for 3 weeks. She got to the compound gate. She pressed the intercom. The gate didn't open. She pressed again. The intercom crackled. A voice she didn't recognize said something in Korean that wasn't a welcome. "Tell Kang Min-jae that Zuri Bennett is at the gate," she said. "Tell him Cho Hyun-suk is coming tonight. Tell him those exact words and then open this gate." Silence. She stood at the gate in the cold and waited and felt the night around her. The harbor smell, the distant sound of traffic. Somewhere a ship's horn, Busan being Busan, at the edge of what was about to happen. And she pressed her hand flat against the gate's cold metal and thought about every decision that had brought her to this specific point, this gate, this night, and whether any single different decision along the way would have produced a different geography. She thought, Probably not. She thought, I would have ended up here regardless because this is apparently... The message came on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months after Zuri had watched Busan disappear beneath the clouds. She was in the clinic, not the Gulf Coast position she'd considered, but a nonprofit she'd built herself on the Oregon coast, a converted bait shop 2 blocks from the water that smelled permanently of salt and old wood, and the particular antiseptic over everything smell that followed her everywhere she worked. It had taken 11 months to get the permits and the funding and the volunteer staff arranged the way she wanted them. 11 months of paperwork and grant applications and town council meetings where she'd sat in folding chairs and made her case with the same flat precision she'd once used to hand off patients in forward operating bases. And it had opened 6 weeks ago, and it was already full every morning by 8. Elijah was in the back room in a portable crib while she worked, which was not ideal, and was also completely non-negotiable, because the woman she'd found for childcare had the flu, and because Elijah at 13 months was a person of strong opinions about where his mother was, and one of those opinions was nearby. She was updating a patient file when the message arrived. It was from a number she didn't recognize. Korean country code. The message was 4 words. The chapel. Thursday. Please. She set the phone face down on the desk. She picked it up again. She looked at the 4 words and felt her body do what it did with things that carried weight. The specific stillness, the breath that went slightly shallow before she regulated it, the assessment running underneath everything else, quiet and automatic as a heartbeat. Please. That was the word that meant something. She had never in any form received that word from Kang Min-jae. She had received instructions, arrangements, information, apologies. She had received thank you. She had not received please. She called the number. It rang once. I found a location, he said. His voice was different from the last time she'd heard it. Not diminished, but altered. The way things were altered by a year of significant events. An abandoned chapel on the coast, 20 kilometers south of you. I'm sending coordinates. How do you know where I am? I've always known where you are. A pause. I've respected the distance, but I need to see you. 1 meeting. After that, whatever you decide. What happened with the files? They were delivered 8 months ago. The prosecution is ongoing. Cho Hyun-seok was arrested in March. 12 officials indicted. The organization, he stopped. It's done. What I built is gone. And you? I made arrangements with the prosecution team. I testified. I surrendered assets. His voice was flat, reporting, the way she'd heard him report information before when the information concerned himself, and he was trying not to perform anything around it. I'm not arrested. I'm not free in any complete sense, but I'm outside. Outside the life. Everything that was the life. It's gone. A pause. I know that doesn't automatically mean anything. I know the distance between gone and changed is, I know it doesn't close by itself. She sat at her clinic desk with Elijah asleep in the back room and the Oregon coast outside her window doing what the Oregon coast did in October, which was to be gray and absolute and indifferent to human complexity. Thursday, she said. Yes, I'll be there, she said. But Min-jae, she stopped. No guards, no convoy, no arrangements. You come as yourself and you tell me what you need to tell me, and then I decide what comes next. Those are the only terms. A silence that had the quality of a man accepting something he understood he had no standing to negotiate. Agreed, he said. She hung up. She sat for a moment, or a quiet. Then she called Day, because old habits were also survival instincts. And Day answered on the second ring, and she said the date and the coordinates, and she said, I'm not asking you to interfere. I'm telling you where I'll be. Day said, I'll be nearby. She said, I know. Wednesday she spent not thinking about Thursday, which meant she spent it thinking about Thursday continuously while performing the full functions of running a coastal nonprofit clinic, intake assessments and supply orders, and a volunteer training session, and a conversation with the county health department that required the specific patience of someone who had learned to work within systems without being defeated by them. She went home to the small house she was renting 3 blocks from the clinic, the house with the view of the water that she'd chosen for the same reasons she'd chosen all of it, because it was real and salt-edged and demanded nothing except her presence. and she fed Elijah and bathed him and sat in the chair by his crib while he went down, and she watched his face do the sleeping face, the completely surrendered unconsciousness of a 13-month-old who had decided the world was safe. She thought about his father. She thought about what a year did to a person, what it did to this particular person, whether she was capable of knowing from the outside, from a distance, from a phone call and 4 words and please. She thought, you won't know until Thursday. Thursday came gray and cold, the coast living up to October's expectations, the drive south on the coastal highway. One of those drives where the ocean appeared and disappeared through the trees in flashes of absolute silver, and the road demanded enough attention that she couldn't think about the destination until the destination arrived. The chapel was exactly what the coordinates had promised. Abandoned, small, stone, sitting on a headland that jutted into the Pacific with the confidence of something that had been there long enough to stop caring what the water thought about it. The roof had been partially restored at some point, and then abandoned mid-restoration, giving it the quality of something interrupted rather than neglected. Around it, the coastal grass moved in the wind, and the ocean worked at the rocks below, and the sky was the specific flat silver of an October overcast that carried light without revealing its source. She parked and sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. He was already there, standing outside the chapel door, not inside, which she thought about. Standing outside in the October wind in a dark coat that was not the expensive wool of before, something quieter, something that had been chosen for warmth rather than statement. He looked thinner. The scar along his jaw had a companion now, something newer on his left temple. She didn't know the story yet. He stood with his hands visible at his sides, which she recognized as deliberate, and he watched her cross the headland grass toward him with an expression she couldn't fully read from 20 meters, and then 10, and then 5. She stopped 3 feet away. She looked at him. He looked at her. You look different, she said. So do you. His voice was quiet. The wind was the loudest thing between them. You look... He stopped. She thought he was going to say tired or well or something navigable, but what he said was, like someone who has been building something. I have been. I know. He stopped himself. I've read about the clinic, from what's available publicly. You could have called. I didn't want to insert myself into what you were making. He looked at the ocean briefly, then back. I wanted to see it exist first, without me in it, to make sure that it wasn't contingent on anything to do with me. She absorbed this. What do you need to tell me? Several things. He looked at her steadily. The first is that the documentation I gave the prosecution team included everything I could find on the corruption network that had protected the organization for 15 years. That case is ongoing and will result in trials I won't be able to stay out of. I'll be a witness for the next 2 to 3 years at minimum. I don't have a fixed location. I don't have money in any practical sense. The asset surrender was nearly total. He paused. I want you to know what I actually am before I say anything else. Okay, she said, keep going. Yurin was located 4 months ago, in Singapore. The documentation I provided was sufficient to extradite her. His voice was flat, reporting. She's in custody in Seoul. The trial is scheduled for next spring. Zuri nodded. Day as well, he said. He's operating a legitimate security consulting business. He asked me to tell you that. Tell him I'm glad. I will. He was quiet for a moment, the wind moving between them. The second thing, the thing I actually came to say. He looked at her with the eyes that had always been the most awake part of him, the eyes that assessed and cataloged and were, she had come to understand over the accumulated encounters of the past year and a half, the most honest part of him even when everything else was constructed. I don't want to insert myself into what you've built. I don't want to arrive with claims or expectations or anything that functions like a prior arrangement. He breathed once, controlled, the old habit. I want to ask permission to be introduced to my son. The ocean worked in the rocks below the headland. That's what you came to say, she said. Yes. You flew from Korea to the Oregon coast to ask permission. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the new scar and the quieter coat and the hands at his sides, and the expression on his face that was not the composed assessment she'd first cataloged in the storm clinic, but something with more surface, something that had been exposed to a year of significant weather and had not retreated behind the architecture in response to it. "He's in the car," she said. Something happened in Min Jae's face. "Zuri. He's asleep. He'll be awake in 20 minutes. He always wakes up 20 minutes into a car trip, and then he needs to be occupied, or he becomes extremely opinionated about it." She watched him process this. "You can meet him. Today. That's separate from everything else. That's just true. That's just a thing that happens today." She held his gaze. "What comes after that is a different conversation." "I understand. I don't think you do, completely, but you will." She turned and he walked beside her across the headland grass toward the car, and she could feel the quality of his attention. Not on her, on the car, on the specific knowledge that inside the car was a person he'd had a photograph of, and a name for in 13 months of abstract reality around, and was about to encounter as an actual human being in the world. She opened the back door. Elijah was awake. Of course he was. His timing had always been characteristically his own. He was sitting up in the car seat with the alert solemnity of a 13-month-old who had recently developed strong opinions about the universe, his dark eyes moving to his mother first, then to the man standing behind her. And he did what he did when he encountered new things. He went very still, and he looked. Min Jae made a sound, very quiet. She wasn't sure he knew he'd made it. She unclipped Elijah from the seat and lifted him and settled him on her hip and turned. Elijah looked at Min Jae with his father's quality of assessment. She had lived with this quality for 13 months, and she knew it, had cataloged it, had felt about it everything she'd felt about it. And Min Jae looked at Elijah, and the expression on his face was the most undefended thing she'd ever seen on a human being. "Hi," Min Jae said. To Elijah. Just that. Elijah considered him. The wind moved. The ocean worked at the rocks. Then Elijah reached out one hand, the gesture he made with things he was deciding about, the reaching that preceded his verdict, and grabbed Min Jae's finger. Min Jae went absolutely still. Zuri watched this. She watched a man who had built a criminal empire and survived a poisoning and run through gunfire and spent a year dismantling everything he'd constructed. Hold his infant son's grip on his finger with the expression of someone encountering something that had no precedent in any category of his experience. "His hands are," Min Jae started. "I know," she said. They stood on the headland in the October wind with the ocean below them, and Elijah held his father's finger and looked at him with the solemn assessment of someone who was still in the process of deciding. And Zuri watched and held her son and felt all the things she felt, the complexity, the history, the irreducible fact of this specific moment, and did not try to simplify any of it. After a while they walked, not toward anything in particular, just along the headland, the three of them, with the ocean on one side and the coastal grass bending in the wind, and Min Jae carried Elijah for the last part of it, when Elijah decided he wanted to be carried by the new person, which he communicated by leaning toward Min Jae with the confidence of someone who had made a decision and expected it to be honored. Min Jae took him with the careful, terrified precision of someone who had never held a 13-month-old and was treating the experience with the seriousness it deserved. They stopped at the headland's edge and looked at the water. "What do you want?" Zuri asked. "Not today, in the long version." He was quiet for a moment. Elijah grabbed a fistful of his coat. "I want—" He stopped. She waited. "I want to earn the right to be here. Not to claim it. Not to arrange it. To earn it." He looked at her. I know that's not a plan. I know it doesn't tell you anything concrete. But it's what's actually true, and I told you once that you were the one who told the truth, when you didn't have to, and I'm trying to—" He stopped. "I'm trying that." She looked at him, at her son in his arms, at the ocean beyond them. "There's a motel in town," she said. 15 minutes from here. It's not much." He looked at her. "You can stay through the weekend," she said. "Supervised. Clinic hours on Saturday morning are 7 to noon, and Elijah comes with me. Sunday. We'll see." She held his gaze. "That's what I'm offering right now. That's the size of it." "That's—" He stopped. She could see him calibrating between what he'd expected, which she thought was less, and what this was. "That's more than I came expecting." "I know." She took Elijah back. the easy practice transfer of a mother to whom this was second nature. And Elijah went without complaint, looking back at Minjae over her shoulder with his father's eyes. "Follow my car to town." She walked back across the headland to the car, and she strapped Elijah in, and she sat behind the wheel for a moment and looked at the headland's edge where Minjae was still standing, looking at the water, and she pressed her hand against her sternum and breathed once, deliberately, and thought about all the versions of this she'd imagined in the 13 months since Korea, all the shapes she'd given to the question of after, and how none of them had looked quite like this, which was to say, ordinary, which was to say, a man standing at a cliff edge in a quiet coat in the October wind, looking at the ocean, preparing to follow someone to a motel 15 minutes away, and call that enough for today. She started the car. She pulled onto the coastal road. In the rearview mirror, she watched the headland, and she watched him walk to his car, and she thought, this is not a resolution. This is not any kind of finish line. This is the most contingent and uncertain and genuinely difficult kind of beginning, and you know that. You've known it since the storm, since the first time you looked at him and recognized something you didn't have a category for. She thought, that's not a reason not to start. She drove south along the Pacific coast, and Elijah chattered to himself in the back seat in the language of someone who had much to say and the full confidence that someone was listening. And she thought about the months ahead, the clinic and the converted bait shop, the motel 15 minutes away, the Saturday morning hours that would now include a man learning to hold space without claiming it, the Sunday that was still undetermined. And she thought, I can do this. I've been doing harder things than this since I was 23 years old. I know how to move through things that don't have guaranteed outcomes. I know how to show up and be honest and not flinch at the difficult parts. She thought about Elijah's hand on his father's finger, the still, assessing quality of the grip. She thought, he decided something today. She thought, children are not wrong about these things. She turned into the town's main street with its salt-weathered storefronts and its fishing boats visible at the harbor end and the motel sign, reasonable, unambitious, exactly the size of what she'd offered. And she parked and got out and got Elijah out and stood on the sidewalk in the October wind. She heard a second car turn onto the street behind her. She didn't look back yet. She looked at her son, who was looking at the fishing boats with the absolute concentration of someone encountering something new and deciding it was significant. She said to him quietly, the way she said things that were for the two of them, one day at a time. Elijah looked at the boats. She heard the car stop. She heard the door. She turned around. Minjae was standing by the car looking at her across the ordinary street in the ordinary October light of a small Oregon coastal town, and he had no convoy, no guards, no compound, no organization, no empire, nothing that had previously defined the context of every version of himself she'd encountered. And he was looking at her, and at Elijah, with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was trying to get to and finds it both smaller and more significant than anything he built in his previous life. The clinic opens at 7 on Saturday, she said. I'll be there at 6:50, he said. She almost smiled. She turned and walked toward the motel office with her son on her hip and the October wind off the Pacific and the full knowledge that the next chapter was going to require everything she had, her patience, her honesty, her willingness to hold complexity without resolving it prematurely, her absolute refusal to mistake the beginning of something for the proof of it. She had all of those things. She had been building them for 32 years. She pushed open the motel office door. Behind her on the ordinary Oregon street, the most feared criminal in the history of the Korean underworld stood next to a rental car with nothing in his hands and waited to be told what came next. And that, the waiting, the empty hands, the absolute absence of arrangement, was the most significant thing he had ever done. The door swung shut. The ocean moved beyond the town. Elijah grabbed her collar with both hands and held on. The first Saturday started at 6:48. Zuri knew this because she was watching from the clinic's front window when the rental car pulled up, and the dashboard clock in her own vehicle was still visible from where she stood. And she thought, 2 minutes early, which was not what she'd expected, which was either punctuality or anxiety, and she suspected both. She went back to the intake desk and did not watch him come to the door. He knocked, which he didn't have to do. The clinic opened to the public, the door wasn't locked. She told him 7 o'clock, and it was not yet 7. But he knocked, and she thought, he's decided that nothing about this is assumed. Every threshold requires permission. She wasn't sure if she'd taught him that, or if it was something he'd arrived at in the year she hadn't been watching, but she filed it. "It's open," she said. He came in. He was dressed for the weather. The Oregon coast in October required a particular capitulation to practicality that had nothing to do with how you'd previously dressed. And he carried a paper bag from the bakery she could see from her clinic window, the one that opened at 6 and smelled like the specific optimism of fresh bread, and he set it on the counter without comment. "Coffee's in the back," she said. "Elijah is at the neighbor's until noon." "Okay. You can shadow me this morning. Watch intake. Don't offer opinions unless I ask for them." "Understood." "And if anything makes you uncomfortable—" "Nothing will make me uncomfortable," he said. She looked at him. "That's not what I mean. If anything triggers an instinct to take over or arrange or solve—" She held his gaze. "Recognize it and set it down. This is my space. You're a visitor in it." Something moved in his face. Not offense. Something more like a man recognizing a fair assessment of his own tendencies. "Understood," he said again, differently this time. The clinic filled by 7:15. It always filled fast on Saturdays. The working people who couldn't come during the week. The elderly who needed the company as much as the care. A young mother with a toddler who'd had an ear infection for 5 days that the family couldn't afford to take elsewhere. Min-jae sat in the chair she'd pointed him to near the supply room door, and he watched. He did not interfere. He did not offer opinions. When the elderly Korean man in the third appointment of the morning, a fisherman named Mr. O, who'd lived in the town for 30 years and spoke Korean at home and English everywhere else, and sometimes mixed them mid-sentence in ways that Zuri had learned to follow, looked at Min-jae with sudden sharp recognition. Min-jae met the look and gave a small nod, and Mr. O said nothing further, and Zuri filed the exchange and continued the appointment. At 9:30, she handed him a box of supplies to move from the storage room to the intake station, because it needed doing and because watching someone work told you more about them than watching them sit. And he moved the supplies with the same methodical care he applied to everything. No drama, no efficiency performance, just the boxes moved to where they needed to be. At 11, she sent him to pick up Elijah from the neighbor. She did this without overthinking it, which was itself a decision. The choice not to overthink it, not to run the calculation for the 14th time, but to extend the thing she was extending and see what it produced. She gave him Mrs. Carmichael's address, and she watched his face when she did it, and what she saw was not triumph or relief, but something quieter, something that looked like a man receiving a weight he intended to carry carefully. He came back at 11:45. Elijah was in his arms. Elijah had his father's coat lapel in one fist and was examining it with the concentration of a researcher. Min-jae's face when he carried that child through the clinic door was not something Zuri could have described with any precision, and she was a precise person who used language carefully. It was not happiness exactly. It was larger than happiness, less comfortable, something that happiness was only a component of. It was the expression of a man standing inside something he had not believed would be available to him. She went back to the last patient file. "He grabbed my hand in the car," Min-jae said quietly from the doorway. "He grabs things," she said. "It's his primary methodology for understanding the world." "I know." A pause. "He's very certain about it." "Yes," she said, "he is." The weekend passed in increments that had the quality of an experiment carefully monitored. Saturday afternoon, on the harbor front, Elijah in a carrier on Zuri's chest watching the fishing boats with his characteristic solemnity, while Min-jae walked beside her, and they talked about the clinic's funding model and the prosecution schedule and the fisherman Mr. O, who had recognized him and said nothing, the careful accumulation of ordinary time between people who were deciding something without announcing that they were deciding it. Sunday, she took him to the tide pools south of town. Elijah was deposited in the shallow rock bowl that Zuri had been bringing him to since he was 3 months old, propped against the rock in his waterproof layers, examining a sea anemone with the focused attention of someone who suspected the anemone had opinions. Min-jae crouched beside him and watched, and when Elijah looked at him with the deciding expression, Min-jae stayed still and let the decision happen. Elijah touched his father's face. Just once. The flat-palmed exploratory pad of a 13-month-old conducting research. Min-jae held still for it, And Zuri, standing 6 feet away on the rocks with the Pacific doing its indifferent Pacific things around them, felt something in her chest that she acknowledged and did not yet name. Sunday evening, she sat across from him at the small kitchen table in the rented house, while Elijah slept, and she said, "Tell me about the year." He told her. He told her in the flat, precise way he told things. The way she'd come to understand was not emotional absence, but emotional density expressed as compression, each sentence carrying more than its surface weight because he did not know yet how to let things unfurl, had spent a lifetime compressing everything into its smallest functional form. He told her about the files, about the decision to deliver them, about the prosecutor in Seoul who had looked at what he'd brought her and had been quiet for a very long time before she said, "I'll need you to testify to everything in here, everything." And he had said, "Yes." He told her about this dismantling, not the prosecution's version of it, which was raids and arrests and asset seizure, but his version, which was the experience of watching everything he'd constructed over 17 years come apart with his own assistance. The particular quality of that process, which was not, he said, what he'd expected it to feel like. "What did you expect it to feel like?" she asked. "Loss," he said. "I expected grief or shame, some version of—" He stopped, chose the word cost. "I expected it to feel like paying. And it didn't?" He looked at his hands on the table. It felt like setting something down. Something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped being able to tell where it ended, and I began. A pause. That was more frightening than grief would have been. Why? Because grief is about what's gone. What I felt was about what was left, and I didn't know what was left. He looked at her. "I still don't, completely." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had been the most feared criminal in Southern Korea and was now sitting in a rented house in a small Oregon coastal town with his hands on her kitchen table, talking about what was left. And she thought, this is real. Whatever else is uncertain, this is a real person trying to find a real language for a real thing. That's not nothing. That's actually quite rare. "You're going to have to stay near Seoul for the trials," she said. "For 2 years, possibly 3. That's a long time." "Yes." "The clinic is here. Elijah is here. I'm not—" She stopped, ordered it. "I'm not going to Korea. I'm not doing that again." "I know. So whatever this is," she gestured between them, the gesture that indicated the thing they hadn't named, "it happens at the distance that the situation creates. You come here when you can. You call. You're present in whatever form present can take given the constraints." She held his gaze. "Those are the conditions, not as punishment, as reality." "I accept them," he said. "I'm not offering acceptance as a concept. I'm telling you the terms of the thing and asking you to be honest about whether you can meet them." He was quiet for a moment. The house settled around them, the particular evening sounds of a small coastal place, something in the walls contracting with the temperature drop, the ocean a presence beyond everything. "The person I was a year ago," he said, "would have managed this, would have found ways to control the distance, would have made arrangements and sent people, and—" He stopped. "I'm not that person in the same way anymore, but I don't know how to prove that except by doing what I said I'd do for as long as it takes for you to have enough evidence to form your own conclusion." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said. "I'm trying. I know." She stood and collected the cups, and at the sink she stood with her back to him for a moment. Not dismissal, just the need for one moment where she wasn't being watched while she felt what she felt. And she thought about the storm and the clinic and the compound and the service road and the headland and the tide pools and her son's hand on his father's face, and she thought, I've been moving toward this for 2 years without being able to see it clearly, and now I can see it clearly, and it is not simple, and it is not safe, and it is not going to ask anything less of me than everything I have. She thought, I've given everything I have before. I know what that costs. I know I can pay it. She turned around. Monday morning, she said, you go back to Seoul and you do what you need to do. But before you go, Elijah wakes up at 6:30 and he has specific opinions about breakfast, and I'll need someone to occupy him while I make it. She looked at him. 6:15. Don't be late. He was there at 6:10. The months that followed had their own rhythm. The rhythm of something being built slowly and with attention. The way structures built slowly and with attention differed from structures assembled in urgency. He called. Not daily. They'd agreed on not daily, on something sustainable rather than something intense, on the model of building a habit rather than a gesture, but regularly with the consistency of a man who had decided that reliability was the form his effort took now. He called and he talked to Elijah, who at 14 months and then 15 was developing language with the same methodical certainty he applied to everything, single words first, and then combinations. And Minjai's voice on the phone produced in Elijah a specific quality of attention. The phone held up, the looking at it, the saying of the word he'd assigned to this voice, Appa, father. In Korean, which Zuri was teaching him the way she'd taught herself, methodically, because the child had a heritage that was half of him, and she was not going to deprive him of it. Minjae's response the first time Elijah said it, she heard it through the phone, the quality of silence, the breath. She filed it in the place she kept the things that were too significant for immediate processing. He came back in January. 5 days. He spent 3 of them at the clinic doing the same thing he'd done in October. The chair near the supply room, the watching, the carrying of boxes when boxes needed carrying. And she watched him become something she hadn't expected, which was useful. He was, it emerged, practically capable in ways that had been submerged under the previous context of his life. He fixed the clinic's perpetually failing rear door latch with tools from the hardware store 2 blocks over, working on it with the quiet persistence of someone who has decided the door is his responsibility, whether or not anyone assigned it to him. He drove the elderly Mr. O to a follow-up appointment. When Zuri's afternoon ran long, Mr. O, who had recognized him in October and said nothing, Mr. O, who, on the drive, Zuri was told later, had said, "I knew your father." And Minjae had said, "I know." They had not discussed it further, and when Mr. O came to the next Saturday clinic, he brought a container of homemade kimchi and set it on the counter and said to Zuri, "Your clinic is good." And she thought, something happened that I'm not going to ask about directly. And she didn't. February brought the first of the major trials, the Cho prosecution. Zuri watched the Korean news coverage in the evenings on her laptop, the way she'd watched the news that night years ago, that had first shown her Minjae's face alongside his name and the word syndicate. And she watched the proceedings with the particular attention of someone who had evidence of her own, who had been inside the events being described in court, who recognized the names and the locations and the structures being dismantled piece by piece under the fluorescent lights of a Seoul courtroom. She watched Minjae testify on the live stream one Tuesday morning. She watched him sit in the witness chair in a dark suit that was not the expensive construction of before, something plainer. And she watched him answer the prosecutor's questions with the same flat precision she'd heard him use when he'd reported the facts of his own situation to her. And she watched him describe things, operations, decisions, years of things, without deflection or qualification, without the architecture. And she thought, this is the same quality. This is the same thing he was doing in the kitchen at the safe house and in the motel room and on the headland. He's doing it in court and he'll do it for 2 years, and it will cost him something every time, and he will keep doing it. Cho Hyun-seok was convicted in March. 42 years. The network that had moved against Min Jae's compound, that had taken 3 of his men, that had been built in part on Yerin's information and Yerin's access. 42 years. Zuri closed the laptop and sat in the quiet house and felt something she recognized as closure, which was not the same as resolution, but was its own thing. The particular settling of a chapter that had finally finished producing new events. The Yerin trial was scheduled for May. In April, Min Jae came back to Oregon. He had a window of 3 weeks between testimony phases, and he drove a rented car from Portland along the coastal highway, and he called ahead, which he always did now, and he arrived to find Elijah standing at the front door of the house. Elijah, at 17 months, was standing everywhere, was pulling himself upright on every available surface and gripping and balancing with the concentrated seriousness of someone who had decided that verticality was the next frontier. And when the car pulled up, Elijah looked through the glass of the door's window with his father's eyes and said the word, Appa. Not into a phone, into the actual air at the actual person, for the first time. Min Jae stood on the front path with his bag over one shoulder, and he heard it, and he stood very still for a moment. And then he crouched down to Elijah's level through the glass, and he put his hand flat on the glass, and Elijah put his palm against his father's palm with only the door between them, and Zuri, who was in the kitchen and could see all of this through the hallway, turned back to what she was doing and was quiet for a moment and allowed herself to feel what she felt, which was large and complicated and not reducible to any single thing. She went and opened the door. The 3 weeks of April were the most ordinary 3 weeks of the entire story, which was also the most significant thing that could be said about them. They were ordinary in the specific way that things were ordinary when the people inside them had been through enough that ordinary was not boring but precious. Breakfast and clinic hours and evening walks along the harbor, and Elijah's developing verbal opinions about everything, and Min Jae reading to him at night from the books Zuri had accumulated. His Korean accented English navigating the picture books with a seriousness that made her want to laugh, which she did sometimes, and he looked up when she laughed, and something in his face opened. He slept on the couch. He had not asked for anything different, and she had not offered it. That was the arrangement, and it was not a source of tension because they were both, she thought, more focused on the thing being built than on the particular form it might eventually take. And the building required more patience than either of them had natural access to, and they were both, with effort, providing it. One evening in the 3rd week, he said, from the couch, while she was reading in the chair and Elijah was asleep, "There's a prosecutor's residence program for witnesses requiring relocation for safety during ongoing proceedings." He was looking at the ceiling. "It doesn't have to be Seoul. It can be a consulate-adjacent city." She kept reading. "Portland," he said, "has a Korean consulate." She turned a page. "I'm not suggesting," he started. "I know what you're suggesting," she said. "I'm not suggesting it formally. I'm noting that it exists as a legal mechanism and that Portland is 45 minutes from here. I'm aware of Portland's location. I thought you might be." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to push this." "Good. I'm going to let you think about it." "I was already thinking about it," she said, "before you brought it up." He turned his head to look at her. She kept reading. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He went back to staring at the ceiling, and she went back to her book, and the house made its nighttime sounds around them, and the ocean was out there doing what it did, permanent and indifferent. And also, she had always thought, in its indifference, something like honest. The Yeren trial broke in May with an outcome that Park Soo-yeon texted her at 6 in the morning Oregon time. 17 years. Conspiracy, attempted murder, financial crimes. She accepted the plea. No trial. Zuri read the text and put the phone down and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the May morning coming off the water. And she thought about Yeren in a courtroom accepting a plea deal. And she thought about the cream coat and the jade ring and the woman who had come to her clinic to warn her and instead to use her. And she thought about what Yeren had said that was true. He will hurt you. Not tonight, not immediately, but he will. And she thought about the rest of what Yeren had never managed to say. The thing under the strategy and the grief and the forward motion, that she herself had loved him, in her way, in the way the people built like her and him knew how to love, which was sideways and with tremendous control and not without cost. She thought, I hope you find something on the other side of 17 years that is worth the surviving of them. She didn't know if that was generous or simply accurate. She texted Park, "Thank you for everything." Park texted back, "Make sure the clinic's still standing in 10 years. That's the story I want to write." Zuri smiled at her phone. First time in a while that a smile arrived without being constructed. Min Jae called at 7. He'd seen the news already. "It's done," he said. "Yes." "How are you?" She thought about the question, the specific quality of it, the not assuming, the asking rather than the arranging. "I'm fine," she said. "Actually fine, not the other kind." "I know the difference," he said. "I know you do." A pause. "The comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling." "My testimony resumes in 6 weeks," he said. "The final phase. The corruption network, the officials. This one will take 3 months, maybe 4. "And after that?" "After that," he stopped. She heard him in that stop, the person who had spent a year learning to stop rather than fill, to hold the space open rather than immediately occupy it. "After that, the legal obligation ends. The relocation program has a 6-month wind-down period, and then he stopped again. And then I'm just a person, without a category. That's terrifying for you, she said. Yes, he said, simply. Yes, it is. I know, she said. I felt that way when I came back from Kandahar, when I stopped being a combat medic and started just being a person who used to be one. She looked at the May morning on the water. You find out who you are when the structure falls away. It takes a while. It's uncomfortable. You don't die from it. I know I don't die from it. You know it intellectually. A pause. Yes. You'll know it the other way eventually, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Portland's consulate office called about the residency paperwork, he said. There's a deadline in July. She looked at the window. At the clinic 2 blocks over. At the harbor visible from the second angle of the window. The fishing boats. Mr. O somewhere out there on one of them with his mixed Korean-English observations about the world. Send me the paperwork, she said. A silence that had the quality of something held very carefully. I'll send it today, he said. The final phase of testimony ran from June through September. She received the paperwork and she looked at it for 2 weeks, and she called her sister in Atlanta, who said, Zuri, what do you actually want? And she said, I don't know yet. And her sister said, yes, you do. And she was right. She did. She just hadn't finished being honest with herself about it yet. She called Dr. Hyun in Busan, who was retired now, and spending his days being fussy about his grandchildren, and who said, the clinic was the best thing this neighborhood ever had, Zurisi, and wherever you build the next one, it will be the same. She started the paperwork in August. She didn't tell Min Jae she'd started it. She told him in September, the week his final testimony was complete. The week the corruption network cases were filed, and the last of the proceedings moved toward their conclusions without requiring his daily presence. She called him on a Tuesday, and she said, I filed the residency paperwork in August. His response was silence for long enough that she counted 8 seconds. You filed it in August, he said. Yes. You've known since August. Yes. You didn't tell me. I wanted to be sure first. She paused. I'm sure now. Another silence. Different quality. Zuri, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not in the storm clinic, or the compound, or the safe house, or the Korean kitchen, or the organ headland, or any of the accumulated moments of 2 years of this. It was the sound of a man arriving somewhere he had stopped believing was possible long before he started trying. Don't make a speech, she said. I wasn't. You were composing something. A pause. I was. Save it, she said. Come in October. Help me pack the clinic equipment. It's heavy, and I'm not doing it alone. I'll be there on the 1st, he said. He was there on the 30th of September, because she should have known. She should have built in the correction factor for a man who, when given an arrival date, treated it as a maximum and not a target. He knocked. She opened the door. He was standing on the front path with the particular look of a man who has been practicing being a person without a structure for 9 months, and has gotten better at it without yet being finished. Elijah was at her hip, 18 months now, verbal and opinionated, and looking at his father with the expression he'd had from the beginning, the still, assessing, decisive expression that was so entirely his father's quality that Zuri sometimes caught herself looking at one of them and thinking of the other. Elijah said, Appa, and then, in. Because he was 18 months old and had decided that the relevant information was that his father should come inside, and he communicated relevant information clearly. Min Jae laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before, not once in 2 years of accumulated encounters. She thought about this later, that she had not known what his laugh sounded like until the moment their son told him to come inside in the most straightforward possible terms. And she thought that was probably right, probably correct sequencing, that some things only arrived when the conditions were genuinely ready for them. She stepped back from the door. He came in. They spent October packing the clinic, which was an exercise in understanding what had accumulated in 14 months of operation. Not just equipment and supplies, but the specific residue of a place where people had brought their hardest moments, the quality of a space that has been genuinely used for its intended purpose. Min Jae packed boxes and moved furniture and repaired the things that needed repairing before she handed the space back. And she watched him work, and she thought about what she'd known since the beginning and had spent 2 years confirming. That work was the most honest form of a person, that you learned everything you needed to know about someone in the way they moved through a task that had no audience. He worked like someone who found it grounding. She filed this. The last day of October, they handed the keys to the building's owner, a retired fisherman named Gerald, who had been charging her below-market rent since the day she'd come to him with a proposal. And he'd said, "I like what you're proposing for the building. Let's talk." Gerald shook her hand and shook Min-jae's hand and looked at Elijah on Min-jae's hip and said, "Good luck up in Portland," and went back inside. They stood on the sidewalk in the October light. "The Portland space has a viewing appointment Friday," she said. "I know, I have the address. It's smaller than this was. You'll make it work. I know I will." She looked at him. "The lease is in my name. I know." "Your name is not on anything." "I know, Zuri. Not because—" She stopped, organized it, said it right. "Not because I don't trust you, because this is mine. What I build is mine. That doesn't change." He looked at her in the October light with Elijah on his hip and the closed clinic behind her and the harbor at the end of the street. And he said, "I know that. I've known that since the storm. It's one of the things about you that—" He stopped. "It's one of the things." She looked at him. She thought about 2 years, about all the accumulated weight of it, about the very long distance between who he had been in the compound courtyard, saying I would never touch a woman like her, and who he was on this sidewalk in an Oregon October with their son on his hip and his name on nothing and his hands empty of everything except what she was willing to give him. She thought, distance is not the same as transformation, but 2 years of evidence was more than she'd started with. She took Elijah from him. And then, because she was a practical woman who had learned that the thing you were going to do eventually might as well be done when you were actually standing in the right place for it, she took Min-jae's hand. Not sentiment, not performance, just her hand in his, on a sidewalk in October in a small coastal town that had been good to her, in the specific, honest light of a thing being acknowledged rather than arranged. He looked down at their joined hands. He didn't speak. He had learned, over the months, that not every moment needed filling, that some things were complete without commentary, and this was one of them. They stood on the sidewalk. Elijah grabbed a fistful of her collar with both hands and looked at the harbor with his father's eyes, serious and assessing, already deciding something about the boats. They had dinner at the diner on the harbor front that evening, the three of them, the kind of dinner that was not a celebration, but simply an ordinary evening in the life of people who had come through enough that ordinary was what they were aiming for. Elijah ate enthusiastically and distributed portions of his meal to the surrounding table space, and communicated his opinions about the bread roll with great clarity. Min-jae watched him with the expression she'd seen in the safe house kitchen and on the headland and at the tide pools, the expression she'd stopped trying to name because it was specific to him and to this child and didn't need a name. After dinner, walking back along the harbor, in the dark with Elijah asleep against Min-jae's shoulder, she said, "When the trials are completely done, the corruption network, the final convictions." 2 more years, he said, maybe less. "When they're done," she said, "we'll have a conversation about what comes after that." "About what it looks like," he said. "Yes." "I can do 2 more years," he said. "I know." She looked at the harbor lights on the water. "So can I." They walked in the dark, the 3 of them, and the harbor did what harbors do. Moved its boats at their moorings, reflected the lights from the town, accepted the tide without complaint. Behind them, the clinic building sat dark and locked and finished with its particular chapter of usefulness, and ahead of them Portland was an hour and a half north and a new space with a Friday viewing appointment and everything that came after. She thought about the storm. She thought about the blood on her gloves and the dim clinic light, and the white card on the examination table, and the way she'd put it in her pocket thinking it wouldn't matter. She thought about all the ways it had mattered, and all the costs, and all the things that had not been simple, and were still not simple, and were not, she had decided, required to be simple in order to be worth it. She thought about what she'd told Elijah when he was not yet language. In the quiet moments she'd talked to him in the way you talk to someone who was present, but not yet listening. Even without a father, this child will know love. She'd meant it when she wrote it. She'd meant it as a truth she could keep regardless of how things went. It had turned out to be a promise she could expand rather than a limit she had to live within. Elijah shifted against Min-jae's shoulder in his sleep. Some internal adjustment, some unconscious settling, and Min-jae put one hand against his son's back, the flat palm steadying gesture, careful, certain, and kept walking. Zuri walked beside them. The harbor lights moved on the water. The tide came in.